It's another beautiful day in Arkansas. It is January and I have new asparagus stalks coming up. So I'm super excited about that. I can't eat them for another 2 springs. You have to, I think, once you have them in the ground, you have to wait for 3 seasons or 3 years, 3 cycles till the crowns get established. But I have like 14 asparagus stalks out there right now and they're so pretty. So that's really great. And I spent some time just this morning deadheading my pansies and lying on the grass again and just being in touch, just grounding in the sun. And it's really great, especially because last year I moved here to the south and it was kind of, I think for the south, a harsh winter, and we got 11 inches of snow in one of those storms. So yay sunshine and 50 and 60 degree weather. I'll take it. So I'm back today just to follow up on my previous talk about leaving or walking away from the Good Girl program. And I wanted to follow up on a comment that was left. And I'm not really doing this from a triggering kind of place, because actually it feels pretty good to be able just to sort of see it for what it is and not get really all entangled in it. But I'm sure there's other people out there who were thinking the same thing and just not saying it out loud. So it kind of dovetails with the section that I wanted to talk a little bit about terrain and flying fairies. So I figured this is a good time to do it. Okay, so yeah, so I had the walking away from the Good Girl program, and I printed out a response in one of the comments. And again, not to point out this person in particular, because I'm sure that this is like a pattern of like many people are holding this pattern. And so I'm just going to sort of go over their response to my response to the video. And at this point, sort of my approach to things is really like, you do you, right? Like all the things happen, and I'm not here to really convince people to come over to my side or join my team or convince them that I have it right, because I don't really have any of those things to offer people. But just my position is to offer an alternative lens, which I think if we all sort of sit with it, that in these resonator fields of people who might be aligned with, oh, we're having, a spiritual awakening, or we're resisting the status quo, or, we're engaging in this larger battle of good and evil, that ultimately we're all about people being able to be themselves, like to be their authentic selves and feel safe and valued for being their authentic selves. So there isn't one way to do it. And if the way I'm doing it doesn't meet your needs anymore, I mean, that's fine. I mean, I get it, because we're all becoming. We're all like, sometimes our holons intersect and then they go the other way. And it would be great to come to a point that we can do that kind of movement of becoming and like the dance of all of the different archetypes without getting really butthurt about it. And I'm not butthurt. So I want to say that, like, I feel like we should be able to be respectful of each other's perspectives and be able to agree to disagree and move forward. Anyway, so within these comments, so I wanted to address a couple of them and then add on, it builds on some things that I wanted to share back. In the one comment, essentially, I think, and I want to paraphrase it because I don't want to, like, you can read it on the thing if you want. But I think it was the idea of stepping back and letting things unfold, that at some point that becomes, what did they say? Like indulgent navel gazing, right? At the expense of, connecting to this pain and colonization of the body and adversarial forces and mass expropriation. And so I think the implication is there's some judgment on the continuum of like where I'm at, that I'm not at the spot that they imagine to be optimal for whatever their needs are from me. So yeah, this idea that the unfolding of the process and being accepting and being willing to be in the flow with it and be the curious observer is, I think, for them in the story that they're occupying, not acceptable. And they're talking about Maya being an illusion and saying that things aren't real. And I didn't actually say that. It's not that I don't think that things aren't real. I think that there's a way of framing it that we have a lot more agency in how we participate with things. And if Me personally, I'm trying to come at things from an information theoretic standpoint. And I think that that we don't really understand this thing that we're inside, and we can inhabit a structure and a narrative that's been offered to us and that we participated in the past, or we can step out and try to explore other options that might feel better to us. And so I'm not telling you have to step out of any particular narrative if that gives you satisfaction. I just kind of outgrew it. It wasn't, I mean, and I'm not saying that to be like I'm superior. It wasn't satisfying for me anymore. And so it's kind of like me deadheading the pansies out there. Yeah, that flower bloomed and it was beautiful while it bloomed, but like now it's just hanging on and it's going to go to seed, which is taking energy away from the plant. And I really want the plants to go through the winter and then have a bunch of displays in the spring into the early summer. So I'm going to pick off the seed heads so that the energy goes into the things that I would like to see, which is more flowers. And that's part of gardening, is pruning things, and that you're allowed to grow and become and prune things out and then be who you are now. And so again, that's this dance of paths crossing and uncrossing, is that's going to happen if we're all becoming. There are times where we resonate together and then times where we don't. And if we can do that without judgment, I think that's great. So I'm not saying that it's an illusion or that it's not real. What I'm saying is me personally, I'm interested in trying to figure out the operating system of what this thing is, and be able to participate in a way that I find more satisfying. And hopefully, I can't presume for other people what works for them or what's good for them, but at least, I'm not trying to do it selfishly, but I'm trying to figure out actually what works to be able to lay it on the table as a sandbox and say, hey, these are interesting ideas for the toolbox. Should we pick them up and play with them and see what we can do with them? Because I think it's an infinite game, and we're smart, creative beings. So why not, right? Like, why not take advantage? And then I think that the next section sort of goes on that, like, I think there's a projection that I'm shutting down because I'm cognitively exhausted, and that this is a unfolding of cognitive warfare, that it's just to wear people down, and so they give up. And I think if you follow my, if you actually look at my videos, not just the talks that I give, but the clips that I put on, because I spend a lot of time listening to talks and not just having it wash over me, but actually trying to integrate them into my worldview. And again, I'm saying this is my reality tunnel. I'm programming my own biocomputer. I recognize this. At a metacognitive level, I recognize that I'm picking and choosing what I'm paying attention to. But it's things that I feel like it's not just an algorithm, it's things that I'm led to, and then the next thing unfolds into the next and the next. And I find it interesting. So I'm still very intellectually curious. I am not checked out. And in fact, I think that being able to step out of the noise and be in my garden, I think there's something was really important for me to we process through our bodies. And yeah, like I said, I'm very up in my mind. To be able to have a year to just be physical and in a landscape, I think put me way more in tune. In this particular landscape, because it's full of quartz crystals, like not my particular property, because I'm more like shale and sandstone, but not far off, that I'm resonating in this space and I have access to intuitive information fields or understanding or time to process and integrate that I wouldn't have had otherwise. So yeah, like there's a great clip that I'd shared before from the A-Life people about samadhi and being able to step into play, and then in immersion and bracketing, that you can immerse yourself and then you can step back and then process. And I think that for me is a super cool tool to use. And so this past year, I kind of gave myself, like mentally, I said, I don't know what the world's going to be. I'm going to give, fortunately, I'm in a position I can take a couple years, and I'm like, I'm going to just make my corner of the world beautiful, and I'm going to be outside, and I'm going to learn what this is, because I spent 30 years of my life in a big urban center where I didn't have a yard, and I couldn't go out and lie in the grass, and I couldn't dig in the dirt. I mean, I had a community garden off and on, and I worked at a garden, but it just wasn't the same. So yeah, that was my intention for last year, to ground in this place. So I think the idea to project onto me that I'm somehow retreating because I'm intellectually overwhelmed is not an accurate assessment. And I think, I'm sure that the person who wrote that, if they sit with that for a little bit, they'll realize that, wow, I was projecting onto Allison how I feel about things, but that projection says more about me than it does about her. And I'm not saying that I haven't done it as well. Like, I've gotten to a point where a lot of the people that I'm researching now that I was like shocked and upset by, because the things that they were saying and proposing were very jarring to my world model. And within the free energy principle / active inference frame, when you have to shift your world model, there's an energy cost to doing that. And so it's really logical that when that happens, when we encounter something that's like, oh my God, what do you mean a digital twin? Or what do you mean like Internet of Bodies? Or what do you mean about these things? And it's like we want to stop and push it away, because we're built to maintain homeostasis, right? I mean, yeah, some of us like to nibble around the edges on novelty, but not something as big as like, oh, your whole, like the scales fall from your eyes and then the whole world shifts. That's a lot to ask for people to make those jumps. And so, yeah, like the initial inclination is when we hear of these things, they feel really unsettling, and we are going to put a label on it and put a wall up and say no. And I did that for a while. I don't think I was as strident as a lot of influencers online, but yeah, definitely. And it took me, we're 6 years into sort of this shift to be like, okay, this is happening. And there's some choices, right? Everybody can choose, and I'm not judging anybody else's choice. You can dig in and I'm going to build the wall higher and say no louder. Okay. And that's a legit choice. I'm not saying that's not a legit choice. That's not the choice that felt good to me, because I feel like the lesson I was supposed to learn was, hey, when you build up a wall and you create this resonance field, it actually may have repercussions you don't fully appreciate that are negative, not only to you, but to the people around you. And you don't mean to do that, but that's what happens. And so that's a lesson I learned. So I'm like, okay, I don't think building the wall higher is great. I may change. I fully hold the right to go back and change my position, because that's the great thing about Curious Observer and Participatory Universe. You can change every moment you're in. As Matthew Segal, I have a whole bunch of clips about his work with Albert North Whitehead. And it's like you have these actual occasions and you integrate the past, and then you see the potential futures out there, and then you align with one of them, and then you create this unit and then the next node. So we've got all of these nodes, which I am picturing as these directed acyclic graphs that are like essentially the digital twins, but maybe we've always had one, but now we just call it a digital directed acyclic graph and a digital twin, right? And that's a word that we are using to talk about it. But yeah, so we keep having these nodes, we have these experiences, we integrate, and then we move forward. And hopefully we can integrate in a way that we get more wisdom and more awareness. So at this point, my integrated wisdom is I'm not building the wall taller. And I've said this before, but I'm not checked out. Like, I think you can clearly see in my video clips of what I do, like, oh, what is Allison interested in now? Now, I'm not on a Substack. I'm not jumping around in the comments. I'm not saying I'm not adding to noise, but you kind of have to show up in my feed and spend some time to engage with it. And so it's not going to be for everybody. And again, I'm not trying to set a high bar. None of this is paywalled. But you have to put in the effort, because I'm not as often coming in and holding your hand and saying, this is exactly how I see things. A lot of the video clips that I make, always with links back to the original, because I'm not monetizing any of this. It's like my open notebook of my mind. What is Allison doing this week? Interesting. And for people who are interested in the things I'm trying to put in my toolbox, and they're curious if they might want to put them in their toolbox, yeah, come and there's very little commenting on those clips. Now, I don't know if that means that people aren't getting stuff out of them, but I don't think you can go back and see how much I've uploaded and think that somehow I've checked out intellectually. No. And the other piece of it is that my journey at this point is way more in person and relational with people that I am physically proximate to, and people that I have collaborations with, where it was easy when it was easier when there was some abstract, quote unquote, bad guy like a Michael Bloomberg out there that was in the public sphere that I could point to and say, look at this thing, and I've made this whole map and I'm telling this whole story, because these are all public figures. The things that pique my curiosity now sometimes are connected to people I have connections to, and it's not my place to throw them into the public sphere. That's not right. That wouldn't be right. So yeah, like you can kind of look askance in the clips that I put in terms of what I'm interested in, and then you can go off, and it's the internet. So you can use my grounding to expand into your own spectacular way if you want. But just me being quiet, it's connecting and grounding in my place and listening to my own inner intuitive sense, being more connected to the field and being in relation with other people. Then I'm just not going to lay it all out publicly. And I think, honestly, at this point, I have laid out a very vast body of information. And at this point, and it's evolved over time, right? And I've been very public about how I've changed my position over time. So it will take, I mean, if someone applied themselves to really integrating everything and all the clips and all the maps, I could sit back for another 3 to 5 years before most people have caught up to like how I think about things if they cared about it, right? It's not like you were supposed to be putting out a 3-hour video every 2 weeks. Like, that's silly. Because why should I run way ahead of everyone and keep running ahead when people haven't even caught up to where I was at the beginning of lockdowns? That's silly. I mean, honestly, that's silly. I've done my part. And at this point, I'm out of the Good Girl program, so I actually don't have to do it for you. I'm doing it for me, and I'm sharing it in case it's useful for other people. But I'm the person who I used to be, who I love and dearly because she was very well intentioned, tried to do it for other people, and that didn't work. And she doesn't need to do that anymore. And so, yeah, everybody gets to do their own thing. I'm not here to save anybody, fix anything. And part of it is, I think, there's this sense of a pivotal time, and we shouldn't abdicate responsibility. And God is playing a perverse joke on our suffering. Like, you need to stand for the truth at this certain time. And I'm like, I don't know what time is. I really don't. I'm not trying to be flip about it. I increasingly lean into nonlinearity. I increasingly lean into, we don't know how this all is. We perceive it as linear. The people who, and this is like what really frustrates me, like, I'm not an ascension crowd person. That's not I respect that some people like that. That's fine. That's not my lens, because I think we're way more cyclical. And I think that that it's open-ended, and that there's not a crescendo. Like I'm all over the place about like my pushback against the apocalyptic mindset. It's just not me. So yeah, and I think, if you did lean into the information warfare standpoint, I think a lot of that has to do with making people feel like they're in this crisis moment and they have to hurry up and act and be intense all the time and burn themselves out. And I'm like, I'm not doing that, because I don't actually believe in that structure. I believe in something that's open-ended and cyclical rather than a linear. But that said, I'm not going to fight anybody who wants to believe the linear apocalypse ascension timeline, because I think it's beautiful that we all get to do the story that we like. Like, I'm at this point. Do your story. It would really suck if the whole world was just like clones of Alison McDowell. Like, how exhausting would that be? That would be really exhausting. So let's not do that. Let's just be able to accept that people have their different things, and that nobody really owes you anything. Like, nobody owes you anything. Just you do you. And it's awesome if people can collaborate and vibe off each other and play in the sandbox and build things, but it's not an obligation. It has to be out there saving people. I don't, I did that for a time, and where I'm at now is I don't think that works, and I'm not doing it anymore. So anyway, I've been pretty clear about that. So I'm going to read the last 2 lines. There's 2 questions, or 2 things I'm supposed to consider. 1, do you think that mavericks like you may be potentially energetically targeted and what spiritual influences have infiltrated your world. So that's interesting. One, I don't consider myself a maverick. Like, I think we all have our own unique offerings to put into the mix. So I think the idea of being energetically targeted, I find that incredibly disempowering. I know that's really pervasive out there. All kinds of energy, like your directed energy weapons, targeted individuals. And I talked about that in the past. I think if you live in that space that, oh my God, I'm being targeted, then you are, because you've done it to yourself. Like, I mean, it's going to be very rare that someone's going to like knock on your door and be like, hello, I'm the person who's targeting you. You know, like you can imagine that, you know, every car that slowly drives by your house, that it's not some like Amazon gig worker who's dropping off packages, but it's the CIA that's going to like come and get you. And, you know, I'm not saying that it's not, but like once you go there, then you are there. You've already put yourself in that psychic jail. So, I mean, energetically targeted. I don't what these spiritual influences. I would rather lean into, wow. Yeah, I'm going to talk about a little bit later about Henri Carbon and his work with Sufism and Surawardhi and the Mundus Imaginalis. But his thing is like, we all have a personal angel, and I'm like, yeah, I'm figuring. I don't have, like, I have friends here who have guides, who have like connections to their higher selves that have much more robust dynamic interactions. And they feel like my guides have my back. Like I have a purpose. That's one of those clips with Angus Fletcher. He's like, you know, the best adjusted people, they have an integrated sense of self from the past that's like like braided into a meaning and then a wide future. And I lean into that, right? I believe that there's a purpose for me being here. Now, you could say like, you're just totally making it up, but how do you explain Vesta House, right? Okay, you know, I could choose another thing that like I'm in exile and I just can't wait to get back and it's because I'm a targeted person because I'm a maverick. That's a sucky story. I'm not doing that story. I'm doing a story that I'm helping with some amazing puzzle that is unfolding, and I'm making lots of new connections with very cool and fun people and characters and learning new things and unlearning a lot of things and becoming more integrated, and there's something cool that I get to do eventually. And I might not get it all done this lifetime. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not here saying it's all going to get done, you know, in the next 5 years. But yeah, I'm synthesizing things. You know, when I had you know, my family's like, you need therapy or whatever. And I was like, oh, I'm not doing Zoom therapy. And then finally I connected with the Jungian who got the Red Book published. And at one point he said, you know, I was talking about the hearts that I made. And he's like, well, you know, what is that for? And I'm like, I think it's for the future me. Like, I think I'm leaving myself clues. And that's a fun way to be. So if your context is information warfare, why do you jump on someone's page and say, I think you might be targeted by spiritual influences that are derailing you? Which is really funny because I know like a while ago, Danny Katz like was hanging out with this chaos magic guy in Austin in her like online spaces and saying like, I think the evil spirits are using Allison to talk about bad, scary things to like influence people. And so now I have like, oh, well, maybe the spiritual influences that they're influencing you not to talk about bad things, you know? That's a projection of the person who's projecting onto me. So I get it. It's because we need to shore up our story. And I'm not good, bad. It just is. You need to shore up your story. And when you find information out there that doesn't fit your world model, like beep, 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 wait a minute, Allison's is exiting the program. Allison is not just angry all the time. And Allison is out making fairies and heart flags and making a garden. This doesn't fit the model. And so like, you can spend energy to recalibrate the model, which is like, maybe I should reflect on that. Is there some part that I can use in my process and see if it works? Or that takes energy, or you can just resample and then lecture Allison that she's doing it wrong. Or how you think you can project, like you're a subject of information warfare and there's some spiritual influence and they're derailing you because you're a maverick and they're trying to shut you up. You know, I would say that's a pretty common story. And the pretty common stories, they're thought forms. They're thought forms. you can, if you like it, you can do that. So the other way is there a way to integrate both aspects of you in a healthy way? Now, it's interesting that someone is going to project on what's healthy for me. Your heart-based, joy-filled, local offline living with your sharp sword of intellectual perspicacity. It is a call to a different kind of service that does not fall for the extremes. So I think there's, like, it's interesting that somehow there's this thought that I've dropped, like, one, that I needed a sharp sword of like my intellectual perspicacity is a sharp sword. I'm going to talk a little bit in a bit about archetypes, but I'm not a warrior. Hello, I'm not a warrior. Like, even though in the last one I was like, oh, I started out and I'm like, I'm a mom, I'm a public school parent. That was my archetype. I didn't know it was my archetype, but that's the one I picked up. And then I was like, oh, maybe that's not you to pick up. You know, or that was you then, maybe that's not you now. I was never a warrior. I mean, I could sort of maybe put on the costume of a social justice warrior for a time, but it wasn't a good fit. And what I am is, you know, some people have said this to me in the past, and it kind of vibes, is like I'm a pathfinder, I'm a forager, and I'm a weaver. And so I'm someone who's out gathering a bunch of stuff in my gathering basket and putting things together and thinking about things in very broad ways and telling stories about what I think, how I see things, not how they are, but how I see them, because I can only speak from my reality tunnel. And yeah, and I really like to inhabit the crone idea. You know, I've spent, a friend of mine recommended Clarissa Pinkola Estes to me, who does Jungian depth psychology. And it's interesting because most of her stuff is on audiobook, not print. I think she did Women Who Run with the Wolves, but it's about, she uses like fairy tales and the archetypal thing of the fairy tale and the crone and like the powerful, wise older woman. I love that. Like, I really vibe with that thing. So that's me. Like, I'm Edda the Giant from Fall. Like, I'm re-sewing the map. Like, I've got the map and I'm remaking it with new embroidery threads. And that's what I like. That's what I'm good at. But we can respect that everybody can do what they want to do. Like, what I might wield is like scissors to cut things in my herb garden, not a sword. And so don't project onto me what you think that I need to be. And I'm saying I have done that to other people too. I'm not saying I'm perfect or I haven't done these patterns. I'm speaking to this because I'm now in a different space from that. So, for example, Joseph Gonzalez, Bantam Joe, he's on his blog, bantamjoe.com. He's just released his new book that's in advance of his video game. And I can deeply respect the amount of time and effort he's used to put his skills into telling the story of what he imagines unfolding, which I think technocracy was something that this woman wrote in her comments. I don't believe technocracy at this point. I used it for a time. I wouldn't use it anymore. But I think Joseph more aligns with that ideal. And his lived experience is such that he's been on the front lines of a lot of these different technologies and is now being very concerned about them. And his game is sort of, from what I can tell, and forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing it, but it's sort of like, you know, a child who's abducted sort of by the deep state to do special intelligence operations, and then the father is trying to reclaim the child. So it's an action adventure drama. And it's very much, if you were a, you know, special forces trained former veteran, you would write the story that way. And for a while I would kind of nip at his ankle and be like, but like love and other things and how we could do it differently. And could we, you know, do you have to go to war against it? And the thing is, that wasn't wrong of me to do because that's how he does it. And if you respect that person's path and their archetype, you and the variety that we have in this world, you have to be able to look at it in that lens. And so, yeah, I was wrong to try to steer him off. It's not how I would do it. I would do it differently. But clearly my go-to is making hearts with natural materials and making maps and telling these big stories, and that's how I do it. So that's a lesson for me. Stop projecting on other people and trying to steer them like you're doing it wrong. Do it like this. That is not helpful. And I'm saying that as someone who has done that to other people. That's not helpful, and we can do differently. I'm bringing this up because I'm not trying to slam this person who left the comment. I'm sure there's probably a lot of people. I mean, there's at least 3 thumbs down on the comments, and I'm sure there are people down there who like, well, I'm not going to say it, but I'm going to think it, you know? And that's fine. I'm putting myself out in public, and you're allowed to think it. But what I'm saying is, 1, I don't feel like I'm in information warfare. 2, I haven't intellectually checked out. 3, I'm not going to take the actions that other people expect because they expect it. I'm going to be connected in my community and follow my path in a way that makes sense to me in my story. And I think it would help the world a lot if we could get to a place that we could acknowledge that different people are going to do it different ways. And that we don't have to expend a lot of energy being angry that other people aren't doing it the way we think that they should be doing it. And I say that as someone who has, done that to other people. So there we go. So where does this all go? Okay. So part of the pulling back and getting perspective is not the checking out. It's understanding the game board better. And I think some people are triggered, like, life isn't a game. If that's how you feel, for sure, then you do that. I think we're doing an infinite game, and love is at the core. So that's my lens. If you don't like it and that triggers you, then you can, pop off and watch some other video. So I want to understand the game board better. Why? Because I know that when you have incomplete information, when new information arrives, you can get very different perspectives on what was happening. And I learned this early in my activism experience when I was fighting standardized testing. And I remembered testifying at a school board meeting, and Pennsylvania had a legal opt-out option. But people didn't know about it. And so I was testifying at the school board meeting, and the school board was very focused on disrupting the functioning of schools. It was not there to help schools. It was there to creative destruction, essentially. And I said, listen, and I was fighting standardized tests because they were weaponizing, in my opinion, against the schools and against the kids, and using it to push them onto technology where I felt like they needed more human connection. And that if we withheld the testing data, it would be more difficult for Boston Consulting Group to do something like they did in 2013 and close all the schools. And so that we should make people aware of their right to opt out of standardized testing, and we could legally do it, and that families should be made aware. And I testified at a school board meeting saying, you should make this available to all the parents in the district, and you need to make photocopies for all the principals, because they don't have copy paper. They can't even get the information out to parents. So it's a legal right. You need to make parents aware, and then you need to support the schools in getting those resources, which you would think, given everything I knew about the school board, that they would be ignore it, be against it, because they wanted the data. Right? They wanted the data from the standardized tests. And I figured, I would go up and say it and ask for it for the record, but I didn't really think any of it was going to happen. And surprisingly, at that time, they were receptive. So then I had to sit back and go, So this is the, surprise, right? In the free energy principle, oh, that's surprising. What does that mean? Right? And I had to sit with it for maybe close to a year. What did that mean? That the school board wasn't opposing us letting parents know about opting out of standardized tests. And it took me about a year in doing the research. And then I realized that it was about ultimately these human capital bonds that were going to run on data streams. 1 test a year was not enough. Even 3 or 4 benchmarks was not enough. They really wanted real-time data streams, and they were moving towards gamified education, where they would embed testing in gamified curriculum, and the kids wouldn't know when they were being tested, and that would create all the time data streams. and that was being backed by the MacArthur Foundation. And the MacArthur Foundation was really central to pushing digital media and learning. And it's interesting because the MacArthur Foundation money is actually insurance money. And so when I get back to this idea of like terrain and the mundus imaginalis and like this space of mathematical potential, ultimately it's about probability and statistics and waveforms, and that's what insurance companies do. Like, and I'm not saying the insurance companies even know, like there's some executive, Mr. MacArthur, when he was, wrapping up his fortune in insurance money, because this was back in like the 60s and 70s, that he knew. But again, what is time? I don't know what time is, right? But the insurance companies are definitely embedded in the pay for success structure. And they were promoting the shift to online education, and not just online, but gaming, online gamified education with real-time data streams. And so once I came to that realization, like, wow, I was presented I wasn't presented, but I thought like the low-hanging fruit. This bad thing happened. Here's an affordance you can use to try to address and neutralize or slow down this bad thing, doing the standard, like opting out of standardized testing. And then when I fought all of that, the fight, it was like a jujitsu move. The fighting of it actually advanced the next phase of the agenda, which was gamified online education. And they would, eventually come to the point of saying, you're right, those tests are terrible. It stresses the kids out. We should do gaming, gamified embedded testing. And you're right, it's not good just to have reading and math. We should test everything. And we really need emotional data too, right? So the social emotional learning data came in. And so I thought I was fighting something where really I was carrying the agenda forward. And I grieved that. I grieved that for like another year. I felt stupid and angry and frustrated. And then I started to see that the people who were the leaders in the resistance movement there, and in this case, it was this woman, Diane Ravitch, whose son, Joe Ravitch, runs RAIN Group, RAINE, which is interesting, with flow state and terrain, with Jeff Sine, who's like major close pals and client is SoftBank, and and they're working in alternative educational credentialing, and just being like, oh, the leaders they set up for the resistance are like also in on it. But now that I realize, like, they may not even know they're in on it, because this may be just this archetypal field pushing in with an attractor state, and people are just stepping into certain roles, and they have no idea the bigger picture. And I do believe this now. Like, I do believe that Diane Ravitch, like, I think she was a smart, I'm assuming she's still alive. I don't know. Like, she was an older woman, and they were like, well, she's not a dumb lady. And I was like, if you don't understand this, ask your son, because he's invested. I'm not holding you accountable for what your son's doing, but like, you have you have access to people who are closely embedded in where this is all headed. And you could ask if you wanted to know. But now that I know free energy principle and active inference, she was not going to change her model. Her model was a certain game. This is the game, like this commenter, right? This game is, about technocracy and, mass expropriation and colonization of the body. And that's a certain story, right? The story I'm inhabiting is that, like, we're all resonating energy fields, and it's all chi, and we're all telling stories and putting costumes on things so we can have a scary movie. But at the bottom is love, and we can get there if we do our own work, our own internal work. And I will say, I think I'm in a position to be able to do this better, because I actually spent a year really working on myself. And, I have a friend and colleague here who does heart forgiveness healing workshops, right? And I did that, and I think it really made a difference. So anyway, so understand the game board, because sometimes you get new information and the terrain is not what you think. So her reality tunnel has the game a certain way. My game board looks differently. Is one right and one's wrong? No, not necessarily. I think all the things happen. So, but I'm choosing to build a coherent, and my vision is not incoherent. Like, I have factual background of all the stuff that I'm talking about. I'm not just hallucinating this. This is based on an alternative viewpoint of information that most people don't talk about. The commenters' information is based on stuff that's all flowing through the energy of the social media streams. My stuff isn't so much, or not as a flow, not as a coherent narrative. It's like bits and pieces, like popping up other ways. And so, yeah, again, I'm not saying one is better and one is worse. They're just different, and you choose. You get to choose, and that's my whole point. And so I was listening to an old talk, like it might have been like set 10 years ago with John Vervaeke, the whatever, the sense making guy. And I have to say, like, John Vervaeke, he triggers me a little bit because he's very full of himself. He's very self-assured in all of the things he knows. And, I'm always sort of wondering in the back of my mind if he'll imagine that my maps and things are overfitted while he's having his sidebar conversations with his daimon Hermes. But this was a really nice talk that he gave. And it was about like chi and magic and flow states and synesthesia. And in the beginning, and I think he does this in a lot of his talks, he talks about like the 9-dot problem and those little puzzles where you have 9 dots and you're supposed to connect all the dots with 4 lines, and then people can't figure out how to do it. But the solution actually entails that you go past the dots outside the and it's not even a structure. Like the dots, they perceive a shape of a square, but there's no real hard boundary because they're dots, right? You go outside the perceived boundary to achieve the connection, and that's like going outside, thinking outside the box. And so that's what I've been doing, is thinking outside the box, not intellectual, spiritual bypass or intellectual checkout. I want to build a different story, because I think the story of like maybe you're being targeted by secret weapons and secret spiritual agents that are trying to derail you because you won't do what I think you should be doing because we need your sharp sword of intellect. Like, that's not a story that I want to do, but it takes a lot of concentration to build a new story, whole cloth. And so this is how I'm stepping outside of the box. So, I'm looking over the notes. So we all have our varied roles. There's the warrior role. That's what Bantam Joe is doing. That makes sense for him. That's his life trajectory. It wouldn't make sense for him to go over and be a flower fairy. Like, that's not him. And that's silly for me to think that he should be that. So in retrospect, I apologize, Joseph, for trying to shoehorn you into some pattern that it wasn't your fit, right? And so you're going to resonate how you resonate. I'm resonating with the forager story weaver thing, and how interesting is it that now it interfaces with blockchain and ingression and laminated spacetime. That's pretty cool. So so I'm going to lean into that. We all have these different archetypes, and I think these archetypes are, have a lot of clips from Matthew Segal from his presentation on Michael Levin's Platonic Space Symposium. And I really liked what he had to say. And I think I've mentioned this before, the thing with Levin, as much as I really appreciate how much I've learned about patterning and bioelectricity and these other information fields, I'm just, at the core, I myself am not a materialist. And I feel like his solutions tend to get hooked into the materialism. And one of the things Matthew Segal was saying is that while he very much appreciates all the work and the ideas of removing this idea of reductive approaches, but that he also doesn't want that embodiment is important, and he doesn't want to imagine that we're just puppets being moved around by a pattern in some Platonic space, that we actually have key agency. And in these when he's talking about the past and the actual occasions and the potentials, he uses a daffodil bulb to talk about that. So I'll put the link in for that playlist, and I really think you should spend some time on it. And then you the potential, the space of potential comes in, and then it becomes solid. And then it becomes a node of history, and then you move forward into the next becoming. And that everything in the world has that, not just human beings, all the things. And so for me, and it's this space of potential. How do we talk about the space of potential? And I'm sure he's familiar with, and I don't know if he's talked about it, but what resonates with me a lot, and I need to spend more time on it, but is the work of Henri Corbin, who translated Suhrawardi, was really interested in Persian Sufism, and looking at, and it translated Suhrawardi and Ibn Arabi, and this idea of the white city, the imaginal city, the active, not just fantasy, but actually this space where the potential exists. And I see a correspondence there between Whitehead's space of potential and the Mundus Imaginalis. And in Corban talks about this outlook in Persian Sufism is illuminationism, and that all is light, which we can kind of imagine that all is light, like we're all resonating light particles and different levels of like slowness and crystallization. But that this illuminationism is that we don't have direct access to God, but that we have our own assigned angel, and that there's this intermediary in this mundus imaginalis between us and source that sort of downshifts it, which is this daimon idea. And that's getting a lot of traction lately. And so, and to me, that's also can be your higher self. And is that like, wow, could it be that somehow what we're calling a digital twin, and we're imagining the engineers are coding it, and Nippon Telegraph and Telephone is doing it, and blah, 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 to us, and they're going to turn us into a puppet, is really something that's always existed, but most of us are checked out. Like we have no idea that it's even possible to have a higher self or to have an assigned angel to help us guide us through this process. And I think that's super interesting. So, yeah, this Platonic space and the archetypes, and I really feel like where things are evolving, like not from a hardcore Darwinian way, but that things are moving and changing and shifting towards humans having more robust relationships with an animist world and these other information fields that we might imagine as this mundus imaginalis or this Platonic space or a place of ingression, right? The Whitehead's ingression. And that the dance between that space and what we perceive as reality is on the boundaries that Chris Fields talks about in quantum information theory, that we're leaving signals on boundaries and we're having nodes. And then I'm super interested in how that then relates to the distributed ledger system, and the fact that the first distributed ledger system was Scott Stornetta and Stuart Haber at Bell Labs in Morristown, New Jersey, and they set it up as a time stamping document, right? And so what if it's all happening at once? I mean, there are people online, they talk about like we need time so not everything happens at once and the past doesn't collapse into the future, and that there's some differentiation. So if you imagine all of those, you see them online as backgrounds, like the little nodes and the lines and the vectors, and they're kind of spinning and connecting and unconnecting and reconnecting. And like, what if that's the boundary? And that's sort of Barbara Dewey's laminated space-time, and building off the work of her father, Edward Dewey, on the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. So to me, like, you could say, okay, now Allison is saying blockchain and digital twins are great. I'm not saying they're great. I'm saying, could there be something else going on? Could there possibly be a different story that would give us more affordances to work with, that would put us in the driver's seat, that would frame it that there's something out to get us, to there's something that's like guiding our elbow and helping us along. That's where I want to go. Like, I want to look at it from the good lens. Because if we look at it from the bad lens all the time, then the bad has already happened, and I don't want to live in that place. I don't want to live in that place. So yeah, so there's this mundus imaginalis and these archetypal fields. And there's a lot of that in Neal Stephenson's book, Fall or Dodge in Hell, which came out in 2017, I think. Let me see, 2019, right? So it came out, and look, so it's a bird, it's a crow. And on the inside, it's crow. It's a bird. And so we're dealing, I feel like very strongly, that the future of information processing, we're going back to Claude Shannon, and the ladies are the computers, right? The ladies with the slide rules are doing the mathematical computation. But in this iteration of the Aquarian age, it's through our qualia, our psyche, our quantum biology, our microtubules, and the two main use cases on quantum biology are photon capture for photosynthesis and avian magnetoreception. And I think I've talked about this before with the cardinal in the Garvin Woodland Gardens wall display, and the squirrel that they're foraging. I think that there's something really, really vital in exploring this interface space that in this interface space, I think the language of that is math. And lately I've been really excited to come across the work of Edward Frankel, who is doing this Langlands program and knitting together harmonics and geometry and what else is Edward doing? Number theory. And that world, like the language of navigating that world, it's a math world, but the math world is it's a world with terrain. And in both Reamd and Fall, there is these games, T-Rain, T apostrophe rain. And I think terrain is consciousness. And I think it has to do with how do you navigate the cycles, whether that's you're navigating it by surfing, by flying, by mountain biking. Like I said, I'm here in Arkansas, and Alice Walton's kids are really big mountain bikers, and being in this flow state of being on terrain, I think that there are correspondences between all of those things. And an ocean, right? Sailing. And I think that's why the Navy is so connected, and also naval aviation, is that there's something about flying and being in a flow state integrated with the prosthetics of your machine and getting into this mathematical space. And I think somehow we're being, the path is opening for us to extend our ways of knowing. And I'm terrible at math. Like, I was such an arts and culture kid. And so for me, trying to figure out philosophy and math and coding and science and economics, it's a stretch. But I think the world shows up for you and stretches you the way you need to be stretched. So, and I don't know if you remember, but a long time ago, I talked about there was a paper, and it was about a field trip that kids in Denver took to a museum. And the museum was about, like, it might have been ritual, like it might have been Hmong culture, Hmong. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. And there were a lot of cultural artifacts and ritual artifacts. And the kids were in elementary school, and they were supposed to have a worksheet where they went through and they found geometric shapes in the exhibit. And so it was taking something that was a cultural artifact, and then it was encouraging them to use a lens of math, but it was not a sit down and read a textbook kind of way. It was an experiential way. And so, and in that, there were two of the kids whose grandparents were shamans, and they were teaching the rest of the class. They saw these different artifacts, and then they were using their own personal narratives to expand on that. And so I really think that paper is core to what we're doing, is that the new form of education is how do children interact with this space. And it's not a space that anybody engineered. It's always been there. It's just people, relatively small numbers of people who either have very rigorous spiritual practices, or people who have clairvoyant practices. That there are some people who get into that space, but it's not the norm. And I think we're getting to the point. And again, this is just my thought experiment. I can't prove it, but this is what my gut intuition says, is that we're moving into a space that our bodies and our psyches are going to be flowing across boundaries into this mundus imaginalis in new ways, individually and collectively as teams. And it involves our auras and our energy fields and our thought forms, and how we are able to like collapse and join as a team in a flow state, and then reintegrate and then reclaim our ego space and reflect and integrate. It's the bracketing, the playful, the in and the out stuff, and that space. And I don't want to find that space to be a scary space. I mean, I'm sure if you are in the scary movie version of this, you could say, they want to drag us into this terrible place and force us to do these things. And if that's what you choose, then you're going to get that thing. I want to believe that God wants to have a more nuanced, sophisticated, interesting conversation with us. And it's our time to step up and like get some new skills. And the skills, we're going to talk about them as Internet of Bodies and nanotechnology and da-da-da-da-da, because that's what you expect, because you're 21st century technology oriented people. But actually it's always been there. It's called chi. And I could be wrong. Like, I'm not, I'm open to the possibility. I'm just putting this out there as an idea to explore, because I think we need to use our imagination more. We need to be open to using our imagination. And so, in terms of like things looking the way you expect them to look, I want to read, this is from the story of R. Ogilvy Crombie, and he's also known as Rock, R-O-C, and he was sort of the grandfather figure of Findhorn, which was the first eco-village, and they built this big urban garden on a Scottish beach, which you shouldn't be able to do, and they did it by talking to the devas, which I think are the archetypal patterns, and working in partnership with them to create a beautiful place. And so in this section, he's talking about his encounter with these beings. Now, there are people who can commune with the elementals, and a lot of it is like they appear how you imagine that they would look. And so this is a section from this book about Crombie. Further meetings with unusual elementals continued. Let's see. Last night, Edinburgh. Last night I had a visit from a woodland sprite who told me his name was Denleo. He was about 4 or 5 inches high, of a beautiful iridescent green color. I facetiously asked him if he was a little green man from Mars, and he said, "Of course not. Don't be silly. I'm a spirit. I live in the botanic gardens, looking after the branches of the trees." He was very thin, slightly suggesting a stick insect or a grasshopper, but with human-like attributes. I find that if one throws away the conceited human habit of comparing anything remotely human in shape with the Greek ideal and consider these beings in their own light, an entirely new perspective is arrived at. This little being was very beautiful, looked at in this way, and I am learning quickly how to hold this perspective in looking at these beings and what a difference it makes. I realized that the earth spirit who was indignant the other day in the botanic gardens because I compared him and his companions to fat infants was right. According to their perspectives, he was not fat. We must all accept these beings as themselves in their own right and not make comparisons with the human ideal, which applies only to the human race. They have their ideals too. Denleo had heard that I was accepted as a friend and wanted to see me. Okay, and I'm going to continue. Encounters with the denizens of the nature kingdoms continued to take on an expanded dimension for Rock as he once again visited the botanic gardens the following day. As recounted in Newton's LBLs, souls can take on various appearances to suit the situation, and the same appears to hold true of nature spirits. Once again, Pan is present. Edinburgh. I felt a strange urge to go to the botanic gardens. The day had cleared up and was beautifully sunny. As I left the house, Denleo was sitting on my shoulder, and he asked if he could travel with me that way. I said, certainly. Communication is really by telepathy, but I was vaguely aware of a very high-pitched chirping voice. And on the way down Dublin Street, I was aware of a beautiful flame on my right shoulder. It formed patterns, but had no form to speak of. I knew it was a salamander and spoke to it. Him? It is doubtful if they have sexual differentiation. He asked me if he could travel on my right shoulder as Denleo was on my left, and I said yes, provided he did not burn a hole in my jacket. And he said he was cosmic, non-physical fire and would not burn material objects, and that certainly they would never destroy anything of mine as I was their friend. And I said, surely he was small. And he agreed and said they varied greatly in size and could alter size and shape at will. I then saw a number of flames. So I'm going to just say it, this altering size and shape. In the documentary about Findhorn, and Findhorn still exists. It was on sort of hit some financial straits during the lockdowns, but the British government put money into it. And now the current director there he was the former director at Esalen. So it's still a very serious thing. In the 60s, the BBC did a documentary about Findhorn and organic gardening. And although I don't know that she was affiliated officially with Findhorn in that documentary, they included Eve Balfour. And Eve Balfour was sort of the grande dame of organic gardening in post-World War II England. And she was also the niece of Arthur Balfour of the Balfour Declaration that created Israel and the Prime Minister of England. But in addition to all of that, he was, for a time, the president of the Society for Psychical Research. And so I think that there are people who understand about working with the patterns. And we have stories that we tell about the patterns, but that the world is way bigger and more magical than we can imagine, and that there's opportunities. I guess that's what I'm saying. Like, I'm not checking out, I'm looking for other doors. That's sort of where I'm at. And the other doors for me are in my garden, which is pretty fascinating. Like as we, in other places, they might talk about them as the devas. And in here, they're more like the fae and the fairies. Okay, and altering size and shape at will, one of the other people who was part of the Society for Psychical Research, besides Marie Curie and Pierre Curie, was Charles Dodson or Lewis Carroll, who was in math and logic. That was his skill, but he wrote all the Alice in Wonderland books. And so a lot of this stuff we're talking about, like Through the Looking Glass, in The Other Place, in The Imaginary Numberland, and the Space of Potential and Ingression and logic, I feel like, are logic gates, the smart contracts of how bringing energy in and out, like what is this interface across boundaries? And a lot of Stephenson's books more recently are about boundary crossing and timeline management. And so, like, it behooves us, I think, to entertain that there might be other possibilities simply that of targeted info warfare. Because if you live in that space, you're already there. Like you're already in the war. But you could step out of the space. Like I've stepped out of the space because it wasn't serving me well. At some point, like there may be a point at which I change my mind and I want to step back engaging in a different way. But for now, like I'm finding these other doors and I think they're super interesting to think about. Again, matching fairies with topological, like topology, which is Matthew Segal said that Whitehead was working in something called Mariotopology, and that Mario, M-E-R-E-O, Mariology is about wholes, W-H-O-L-E-S, like an entirety and parts. And Segal was making these connections with Levin and embryology, and that in the zygote, you start with a whole and then it differentiates into the parts. And that many people who are working from a materialist lens are trying to assemble lots of different parts into a whole, but it actually can work the other way around. And so Mariotopology is looking at these forms of wholes and parts, but also linking in topology, which is the terrain. And someone I've mentioned several times before, and I still can't admit I do not understand all of what he's saying, but I know it's important. Donald Kunst, K-U-N-Z-E, he's a professor emeritus of architecture at Penn State. But he works at this intersection that's really interesting of art and architecture, of Lacanian psychoanalysis, of projective geometry and topology and media theory. And he's fascinating. Like, I mean, I wish, and he speaks in this very kind of, he's not intentionally cryptic. He has this really easygoing delivery, but the things he talks about are so complicated. But I know that they're linked into like this idea of Mariotopology. So the scale, right? Alice in Wonderland was big and small and inside and outside, and how this works with the idea of clairvoyance and psychic work and global governance issues, right? And superorganisms and navigating boundaries, like being a good boundary crosser, like, being at the crossroads, being able to sort of figure out how to do the navigation, I think is really important. Okay, so going back to these little creatures can change their size at will. And I then saw a number of flames traveling along the pavement, and they kept changing shape and were almost the most wonderful color. And some were about 10 feet tall at times, and occasionally the shape veered towards a human one. And I realized that my acceptance into the elemental world was complete, and the veil had been lifted. Turning into Inverleith Row, I saw many shapes. Beautiful silver-colored sylphs and green dryads, and the shapes were mostly changing, but occasionally a hint of a human form. There were a lot of little elves and gnomes, occasionally clad in brown and green, but often quite naked. I was told that their true spirits are almost formless, changing patterns, but that they take on aspects which to a great extent are projected onto them by human beings. That is, human beings expect to see them in certain shapes and dressed in particular ways, and myths have been built up through the ages. These entities take on the myth and appear to those who believe in them as they are expected to. They also tend to take on a human shape because it is more acceptable to us, and partly because God created man with a special physique, and man could be a god if he lived right according to God's will. The human form is something to be aspired to, therefore, and those entities do not wear clothes, but appear to us to do so. Their quote-unquote clothes are really part of themselves. They respect human conventions, though they often think them stupid and will not try to shock us. Because of my nudist attitude, they can appear to me naked. I am not projecting clothes onto them, and they are not having to create them. Fig leaves and prudery do not really exist in this world, but I find they very frequently appear as their spirit essences to me now because I can accept them like that. I don't call for human shapes. They are, of course, very ephemeral and transparent and extremely beautiful. It is quite impossible to convey a real sense of beauty in words. In the gardens, I was aware of multitudes of beings, elves and gnomes dancing around the trees, tree spirits, dryads, tiny spirits. Then Leo pointed out his friends to me sitting on the branches of the trees, sometimes clinging to them, and many of them danced over to me and greeted me, and Pan was there walking by my side. The gardens were looking superbly lovely in the late afternoon sunshine. This was one of the most glorious moments of my life. And then this is the last section I think I'm going to read. Okay, which Pan? On a further meeting with Pan, Rock is at once challenged as to his acceptance of the traditional appearance of Pan. It is important to realize that the visualizations of generations of mankind of Pan as the cloven-hoofed god led to the creation of that idealized thought form. But the essence of the being is capable of adopting any form to suit the occasion. As pointed out earlier, a similar situation exists in the human realms where, for example, an individual undergoing a near-death experience may meet the traditional angel complete with wings. The same quote-unquote angel, however, may take on the appearance of a wise old man to someone who has atheistic leanings. Edinburgh. Pan came in and sat in the armchair with its back to the door opposite the one in which I was sitting reading. There was a period of silent communion, and presently he stood up, and as I watched him, he slowly changed into the conventional type of Greek god, the Greek ideal of the human form. He stood looking at me and then asked which aspect I preferred. I immediately said I preferred the Pan with the cloven hooves, the shaggy legs, and the horns, as he was the woodland god I loved and respected. And he smiled, and I knew that my choice was right. He changed back into this aspect, asking me if it was wholly and completely acceptable, and I said completely so. He said that aspect might have been originally man-inspired, in a way man-imposed, as there were so many of the aspects of the elementals and nature spirits. But it was age-old and fixed, and he said he was pleased and now entirely satisfied that I accepted him completely in this aspect. So, I mean, I know that sounds pretty wild, right? Like, there's part of me that would have said back in the day, whoa, like, that is too far. I have a clip on there with Tom Cheatham, who is he was actually a scientist, a professor of biology. He worked in complexity theory early in his career. And then he had sort of a spiritual awakening journey. He encountered James Hillman, who was a Jungian analyst who was sort of on the fringes and working on soul alchemy. And then through Hillman, he discovered Henri Corbin's work. And so he's written a lot in a way that's more accessible to the general public on Corbin and Persian Sufism. And so there's a really nice talk that he gave with the Essentia Foundation, which I just hate the ads that are on so many of these things, and I don't know why. Like, why does the Essentia Foundation have to monetize their YouTube channel? It's so annoying to be in like this deep, thoughtful conversation and then be like, do you want to know how to burn fat, or do you want to do Tai Chi walking? Or it's so annoying. So anyway, if any of you are connected to Essentia, like, consider not doing that because it's really disrupting. But anyway, so Tom Cheatham, like he was talking about the Mundus Imaginalis and all of this stuff. So, you know what, I'm just going to take a little break for a minute and get a little water and come back. I had to get a little lunch and get a sweater because it's getting a little cool finally. So I got a little distracted when I was finishing before, but I wanted to mention about the idea of the elementals. That it's interesting in the Crombie book. Part of like he has this whole dialogue with Pan over the course of, I guess, several years, and he doesn't know why it's him. Like, and I guess the idea in the message that he was getting is that his task was to sort of blend the natural elemental world with Christianity and like bring them back together. And he couldn't figure out why him. And it turns out it's interesting that he, as a young man, had a heart condition because like the heart field seems to be really central to all of this. And he was a musician. And again, I have a clip talking about the connections between music, and that's the Tan Cheatham, the music and physics, and that like Einstein would process and then play music and then think and then be able to integrate. So there's something about that topological landscape that is mathematical, but it's also harmonics and frequency. And so he was a musician, and because he had a heart condition, I think he wasn't able to be in World War II. And either during the war or after, he lived for 10 years out in the British countryside in a gameskeeper's cottage that had just a pump, like no running water inside or electricity. And he was just very inward. He just spent time on his own. And again, not as inward, like, I'm not that inward, but he just spent a lot of quiet time on the land. And he would there was a mention in there about his nudism, that he would do nude sunbathing by himself in the countryside, and to get the vitamin D or whatever ground. And that Pan was like, well, did you not realize that you were nude sunbathing on these two like very powerful ley lines? And so that's why, according to the story, that's why they picked him. So anyway, I find it really interesting about the elementals in the Botanic Garden, because my background is I spent these 17 years at Bartram's Garden, and this really like North America's supposed oldest botanic garden. And it was on the fall line between the Piedmont and the coastal plain. And thinking about it now, there actually were two. So right across the river was a big oil refinery, the first oil refinery in North America, actually, because oil was first discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania. And so on the other side of the river was the oil refinery. So there was a big natural gas pipeline that was underground with like signs. Like I never saw it because it was underground, but I would see the signs like, don't dig here. It's a big natural gas pipeline. Not just a little one, but like a big one. And then running through that same corridor was a giant electrical power line. And I think in retrospect, maybe it was good that I moved on from there, because it was good that maybe I was only working part-time, because being in that big, powerful electrical field was something. And that's the first place that I met Roz Ben, actually. And it was like, I was not a woo-woo crystal person at all. I mean, I'm still not, like, I don't align, like, it's not my go-to. I'm not super knowledgeable about crystals, but I didn't understand them as technology, right? I didn't understand like crystal lattice structures and math and frequency and how it all worked. And so we were having I think I've said this before, but a Halloween movie night called, the movie was Attack the Block. It was some British kind of, I think, relatively family-friendly, scary movie. And we were showing it, and he did an intro before and then had all of his crystals set up. So anyway, that's how I first met Roz Ben in person. And so there's some pretty powerful energy on Bartram's Garden itself. And so now I wonder, I mean, I wasn't doing any nude sunbathing at work, but if just spending this time with the elementals, even though I certainly don't be like, hey, dude, riding on my shoulder, I don't have that level of access. Although I don't question that some people do, that I have this resonance. And even as a child, I spent a lot of time like playing in woodlots. And even though it was like, when we were always in the suburbs, I'd always like jump the fence and be on the farm, or like walk the creek, or, even like in the riprap of stormwater management, like finding the quartz crystal rocks in there. And so the garden piece is really a part of it. And so again, my journey here was I wanted to have a garden. Now, I'm not somebody who, as a single woman of a certain age, I was not prepared, and, just finances, to manage a big property. There are some people that their goal is to have, like homestead and acreage and stuff. That wasn't really what I thought I could pull off. But even just having this 1/4 acre and gardening it really intensively, it's been quite amazing. And even just getting the messages, just not message, but like correspondences, right? Like today I mentioned the asparagus, and I planted Lenten rose, several different kinds, and I spent more money on the cultivars where the flowers face up instead of hanging down. And so I saw the first 2 Lenten rose hellebore buds on there. So I'm really excited about that, and seeing like these lush blankets of larkspur seedlings that are coming up from just having gone to seed last season, and just thinking about this year, just all of the things that are going to be, I can welcome back, because last year my garden that I had started the fall before was just very, very meager. And so now I actually have things established, and I can see how they're doing. And anyway, so the gardening piece and the role of the elemental kingdom in working with this interdimensional pattern space, that I think the plant kingdom is at somehow this edge. And so someone in some video I watched had mentioned this book. And so I ended up ordering it. And it's interesting because this copy was an ex-library book from Christ College, Cambridge, which is interesting. And it's from 1949, The Living Plant and the Science of Physical and Ethereal Spaces, a study in the metamorphosis of plants in light of modern geometry and morphology. And it's by George Adams and Olive Witcher. And Olive Witcher's last name is Whicher. And it was published by the Goethean Science Foundation, Clent, Stourbridge, Worcestershire in 1949. And so I think this is really important. Plants. Don't say I don't ever raise up interesting things. So Olive Witcher, she did a lot of work in projective geometry. And again, we go back to Donald Kuntz, where I thought he has all this stuff with projective geometry. And if you imagine the Platonic space and the Whiteheadian stuff about ingression, and Chris Field's idea about quantum information theory, that we're systems in superposition and we're communicating on boundaries, that's a projection, right? Like that's this holographic screen that we're projecting through. And if this superposition space is all math, and most of us don't have a really high facility with that kind of language, but that it's projecting down into reality, and it's light, right? If we're dealing with ultimately vibrating light and energy, then it's the photonics. And who's good with managing light? It's the plants. And, our mitochondria, right? Like it's the little photon capture and the energy and the ATP. So the plants are really central to all of this. And so this was by the Goethean Foundation. And Goethe was early on working on this idea of color theory and plant resonance and morphic space. So it's really interesting that Goethe is probably like the progenitor of like he influenced Steiner and also Rupert Sheldrake, and now the morphospace stuff is being woven into like the cello digital currency with, I have a clip with Sepp Kamvar and Charles Eisenstein, Sacred Economics, talking about the morphic field and currency and electrical fields. And then of course, all the morphology is the Levin, and how does the Levin's work in the morphic development, right? And then we're back to Whitehead and the mereotopology and the Conrad Waddington's epigenetic landscape. Like, how do you flow through the valleys and the hills to create something that's desirable? And so the plants are at the core. And then a while ago, several years ago, Sean, my friend Washington Sean, had done a lot of work into Cleve Baxter and his work with plant physiology and lie detectors and fields of plants where you could go and pretend you were going to cut a leaf off a plant, and the other plants in the room would be like, and you would get an electrical pulsing. And so somehow, and I have the other clip with the woman in the Netherlands talking about the mycorrhizal fungi and the tree roots and the economics of the exchange. So there's all this stuff about ingression, light, other spaces, exchanges, boundary crossing, creation at the edge, at this edge space. And the other thing is, there's this guy, I can't remember his last name, Timur is his first name, Timour, and he's with this Edge Cities group. And he's partnered up with Glenn Weil. And so these Edge Cities, which are like these pop-up co-working spaces that I think are sandboxes for sort of future fluid, intentional community, they have their own community currencies, right? And so the community currencies links back to the Schumacher Center and Keynes and Schumacher and Elia Benartzi and Bancor and the Lev Hart currency. And that was based on with Ari Ben David, who was the Jerusalem contact for the anthroposophists. So these folks were anthroposophists. I don't know if I made that clear. So they're anthroposophists, and they were teaching classes in England on projective geometry and sacred geometry. And I think they were in the same milieu, although predating Keith Critchlow. And I have this book, The Hidden Geometry of Flowers, Living Rhythms, Form, and Number, Keith Critchlow. And this book, it's kind of thick. So he built off this sacred geometry work. And he's backed by Prince Charles. I mean, that was his. So this is from 2011, was the publication, 2011. So yeah, like the sacred geometry of the flowers. And of course, you hear a lot about human flourishing. So, a lot of people would be like, oh, I hear these trigger words and I'm all scared and these must be the bad guys. And I'm like, good, bad. I want to know the operating system. Is the operating system a projection? Is it a projection from the mundus imaginalis? Is it onto this reality? How do we interface with it in a good way? Flowers. I like flowers. I can work with flowers. And then I'm here with my friend Star Ripperetti, who went from nuclear medicine to flower essences, and she has contacts with the elementals. Like, they offer her guidance. I don't know if it's the same as Crombie, but she is plugged in. And the next thing for my space is I want to expand beyond my backyard, and the portal, it's on a couple of acres of land that's mostly wooded, but I want to start doing it's cut. I'm sure it was part of a meadow at some point, but it's grown back up, and a lot of what it's grown up with is privet, which is very invasive here. So she's done amazing work to really clear it out and reclaim the land and remove the capriars and the privet. But I want to try to start bringing in and doing native wildflower plantings, right? And so this is my new engagement. Like, this is how I can express myself, is with plants. And you would think, like, this person who's projecting that I haven't got my sharp intellectual sword and I'm out jousting for, against oppression or, what is it, mass expropriation or, body colonization or whatever. Like, no, I'm in the woods, but I'm figuring it out, because part of that is we're having resonance with spaces beyond. Like, how do you look for affordances that are beyond your narrow thing? If they're going to put you in the 9-dot box, how do you get out of that box? And for me, getting out of the box, I'm not saying for everyone, but for me, has been being in the soil and being with plants. And how cool is it that now somehow plants meshes with projective geometry and sacred geometry and symmetry and math and light and the possibilities of morphospace, right? Like, how awesome is that we can play with that? We should play with that. And the bummer thing about here in Arkansas is that it's been so warm, which has been really nice, but I didn't get my winter sowing done, my seed sowing. And a lot of the native plants, they need 60 days, if you pronounce it scarification or something, but they need freeze thaw. So normally you would put the jugs out, and for 2 months in January and February, it would be really cold and the freeze thaw stuff would happen, and then the plants would germinate. And if they don't get that, they don't germinate. So now I'm going to have to put them in vermiculite and sandwich bags in my refrigerator. And I don't have a very big refrigerator, so like a third of it's going to probably be baggies of seeds. But to get this going, because I'm really excited about the project of trying to start introducing some native plants and seeing what comes, right? Like, it's visiting. It's like having a visitation from another dimension, right? The resonance of the seed resonating with that information space. So anyway, so I don't have fairies the way Crombie did, but I also don't have a heart condition, and I'm not a musician, and I didn't sleep for 10 years naked on a ley line. So I guess I can't expect that much, but I can still be in resonance, which is where I'm at this point. So, okay. And so the other thing is, I mentioned about gaming, and so this thing about like the sharp sword and like how you play and what your archetype is, I don't do video games, but my understanding in the gaming world is there's like action adventure games where you go in and you do stuff, right? There's engagements and there's conflict and there's, leaderboards and points and things like that. And then there's also these role-playing games that are open world, where really the point is just you wander around and explore things. And so the last time I really had any connection to like online digital world type of stuff, it was like way back with SimCity. And I didn't do it a ton. I don't know, I don't even know like if we bought the program, but it stressed me out to try to run a city. Like, I never had the right amount of power plants or the right things. Like, I did it a little bit and it just but I get stressed easily. And so what I did like was you could go make a landscape. And, I haven't ever done any of that Minecraft or whatever. And I think it's kind of annoying that it's all squares, but like, I loved in SimCity, like making landscapes. And so I'm realizing that these landscapes are kind of like consciousnesses. And then you've got ridges and valleys, which is the Conrad Waddington's epigenetic landscape. And that the valleys are these attractor basins. And so when I'm talking about trying to find another door into another space that will give us like a new way of doing things, other than the story of like you're being attacked by forces you can't see or imagine, in an informational warfare space and you're probably really screwed up. So you should step up and like sacrifice yourself for other people. Like that just doesn't appeal to me anymore. So I'm looking for some other doors. And so this other door I'm looking at is like, okay, how do we work with the landscape? And I think that the Ethereum people know this. Like, I think the ether is this other realm of potential. And the logic gates with the smart contracts are the energy flows in and out of the ingression, and that we can, and I don't know what their motivations are. Again, I haven't lost my morality. I'm still not up for like kids on surveillance play tables unless somehow we all as a society agree it's a good thing and we do it in an honorable way, which I think we're very, very far from. And I don't know, I have a friend who was telling me that, I guess, like all of the stuff with the public service corruption in Minnesota is so wrecked. And of course, that's the Minneapolis Federal Reserve was really central, Arthur Rolnick, to human capital finance. So yeah, I'm not saying the stuff that I was saying was going to be happening is now all seem to advancing, but maybe there is some way that you like kids want to play games and be oracles and like help run reality, and we can do it in a way that's caring and loving. I don't know. Maybe it's impossible, but maybe it is possible. And if you can't imagine that it's possible, it's not going to happen. So, and again, remember the Margaret Naumburg, who is one of the first Montessori instructors, she was connected to a lot of the Gurdjieff space and clairvoyant work. So this idea of Sepp Kamp-Varden, Wildflower Montessori, and the internet, spatial web, and the AI, and the kids in classrooms and collecting data and potentially harvesting at scale, right? It's going to have to be at scale, like the psychic and computer, to navigate these other dimensions. Like, kids are really good at imagination. Adults are not so good because we're all caught up in like we forgot how to be imaginative. So there's some logic in the idea of tapping into children's imaginations, but like, how would you do it in a way that wasn't super creepy and like being a jerk and being predatory? And yes, I get that given current circumstances, like you wouldn't lean into that automatically it's going to be a good thing. You would lean into automatically it's probably going to be a bad thing. But then let's all get up to speed and talk about it, because maybe the kids are the answer. Like maybe imaginative childhood is super awesome and then they get to, help run the world or something. I'm not against that possibility. I'm open to different possibilities. But I think that's where things are maybe going. So I kind of lost track of where I was in all of that. But yeah, landscapes, attractor basins, Ethereum. So I keep telling people that they need to look at Kevin Iwaki's Gitcoin 2024 comic book of strange attractors or attractor fields, because they talk about programmable money and landscapes and these basins. And this is where I think Robert Anton Wilson's theory about what the thinker thinks, the prover proves, where this fits, is that what Matthew Segal was saying is that in the idea of these actual occasions, and then you're on a trajectory, you have this next node, you're integrating your past history, you're bringing in possible futures that are infinite, but they quickly start falling away because most of them are not relevant. And then there's like a short list of ones that are relevant, more relevant to you, that you have agency in choosing. And that the ones that stick around somehow have to do with your values or your trajectory or your progression as an agent. And so this is what I think might be happening is if you as an agent are telling a story that you're caught up in a loop that there are these bad things, that becomes your reality model. And if the field works this way, that they're trying to limit the options to the ones that are most relevant to you. If you are in a feedback loop of the negative things, if you're in an attractor basin, because that's how it works, is like if you fall into the valley, like it's like a little dish, it's hard to get out. And so if your reality tunnel has put you the model that all of the things are probably going to be bad, that you're probably being spiritually targeted and that you're probably not in control of what you think and you're probably doing everything wrong, you're going to be stuck in this basin. And then according to like the Whiteheadian process, and I'm no expert, but this was my takeaway, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if the choices that are available to you are the ones that continue your current model and trajectory, you're just going to get more shit, right? Like, and that kind of makes sense, is like what the thinker thinks, the prover proves. So if you're on a certain trajectory, you're in the basin of despair, I mean, the system is agnostic. They're like, well, they seem to like this. This is where they put their attention. So I guess we should, let's let the other stuff fall away that might be good stuff, because that's certainly not relevant. Let's give them some more bad stuff. I mean, I don't know. I think I'd like to hear what people think about that, because that's an interesting idea. And if we have if the idea of a digital twin or directed acyclic graph exists, and we're like sending our signals on the boundary, and it's not something new, but it's something that's always been there, we just didn't have any words or consciousness of it, how might that work? And then how you get out of the attractor basin, because the deeper you are in, the harder it is to get the energy to like get back out. And so the Ethereum people are, I think, in their idea of programmable money, looking at ways of navigating topology in attractor basins. And maybe not all the attractor basins are bad things. Like maybe you're stuck in something that's really awesome and you like being there. But I think that they know that it's topological. And so, yeah, so how do we work with that? Because the topology is our individual and our collective consciousness. And maybe there's ways of using like pattern placeholders and templates to get to places that we wouldn't normally get. Like when you see Levin drawing these diagrams of morphospace, and like a bunch of things are all over here in one corner, and then there's all of this other space of possibility, which is part of what's in the Fall, Dodge, and Hell book about emergent consciousness. That the guy who gets his mind upload, he has little fragments of his memories from before, and so he starts rebuilding a model based on some version of the Earth. But his like nemesis says, wait a minute, like that was never good. This really sucks. Like now we're stuck in this template that wasn't good in the first place, and we had all this other potential we could have tapped into and we didn't, and that was a lost opportunity. And so it turns out that guy is actually also kind of challenging, but it's an interesting idea. It's a really good, interesting idea. So, okay. So that's open gaming. And so I've mentioned before about, again, birds and flying. So very interesting, right? That my friend Star sends me a clip, and it was about like fairies. And then I'm like, oh, for the solstice, I have this whole, why don't we make flower fairies and forest fairies? And so we have this whole activity about the forest fairies. And then we did it a couple times because we did it again on New Year's, and we hang them in the forest, and it's fairies. And then it turns out there's an important character in fall that is Maeve the fairy. And so, and then I'm making all of these owls, right, which are birds. And so there's the flight element, and I keep bumping into people who have like connections to the Navy, which is consciousness, and naval aviation in particular, which is flying and ships. And so it's like, and it's just interesting to think about. So how do we navigate this new terrain? It seems to be math. That's where Edward Frankel is like working with Pythagoras and working with music and working with harmonics in that space. So that's all very interesting. It seems to me to be an overlap with David Eagleman, who does a lot of work in synesthesia and haptics, and like how you come up with different ways of using your body to interpret information. So one of the examples that he had was a drone and then the operator would wear a haptic vest, and so that when the drone went beyond the sight line of the operator, the pitch and roll and yaw and different things, you could feel it in the vest. And so it was a way of communicating language in the body. And so I think, yeah, on the one hand, it's about drones, but it's about something much more than drones. And I think it's about like how we use our bodies in these, like how we can be embodied psyches, how our psyche connects to our body while our psyche and our consciousness is in this interdimensional space. And then your intellectual properties, your experiences, your quality in those spaces, that's where like Melanie Swan's blockchain cloud minds fits in. And then the tokens are placeholders and signals and languages that hold the pattern and then maybe feed it into a large data lake that then aggregates it across many people who are making quests or journeys individually or as teams into that space. And flight seems to be a big part of it. So synesthesia is a big piece. I feel like in the Stephenson books, the Baroque cycle, there's a whole ongoing conversation across several books about the rivalry between Leibniz and Newton on the calculus. And again, it's waveforms. And remember, Leibniz was very much interested in the I Ching and the Characteristica Universalis. So what if that universal language is the language of math into the field, into this space of potential, into the mundus imaginalis? And I don't know like how to segue into it, but the other one of Stevenson's books, he is The Diamond Age, which is about a young girl having a primer, which is essentially an iPad, but this was, published in the early 90s, well before anybody publicly knew about iPads. And there was an actress who lived halfway across the world who was paid on distributed ledger technology to act out stories for this poor girl who was going through a lot of trauma, to navigate a layered puzzle and acquire keys in her sort of self-actualization. And so I feel like that's sort of where the educational process is going, is that there's some aspect of us going, like if you look at the Acton Academies and the hero's journey and the quest, is that young people are going to be brought along with this idea of scaffolding into dramatic play, where traditional subjects are taught in new ways, in new languages that we might not even be able to conceptualize because they may involve lots of haptic vests and different things. And they will be interfacing more regularly with this realm of Platonic space, mundus imaginalis, potentia out there. And again, I don't know for sure, but everything that I just feel it, that could be what's going on. And so like Leibniz and the calculus and the characteristic universalis is like, how do you learn a language of keys to get into that space? And within the cryptography space, I have on several of my maps, Colonel Fabian, who was Fabyan on the Fox River outside of Chicago, who had an estate. And he was like the first sort of private military contractor, and he was doing a lot of research into the Baconian cipher with Shakespeare and encryption, but then he also worked with William Friedman, who was a botanist, so there's lots of connections. J.B. Ryan was a botanist, Friedman was a botanist, connections between plant physiology and encryption. And his big business was in acoustic tuning forks, like high-grade precision tuning forks, like acoustics. And it turns out like many years later, Fermilabs and their big cyclotron was built like 10 miles away from this estate. So, and then Elizabeth and William Friedman, who worked on the Baconian cipher, they became the early cryptanalysts in World War I. And William Friedman founded the NSA. Elizabeth Friedman was a major person in the FBI and doing code breaking for bootleggers, including Joseph Kennedy, who spent a lot of time in Hot Springs. So there's a lot of stuff with like sound and codes and puzzles and waveforms and water and like, how does it all work? Because I think any of us are only going to get little bits, right? And the teams might get little bits, but then there's some larger pattern aggregator that's like holding a lot. So it's like we're all different little edge units in a biofilm, like sending signals back, and then there's bigger pictures being put together. Okay, so now, so I talked about boundaries, about directed acyclic graphs or digital twins, about that like, in Whitehead, the idea is your trajectory is a value system, and that's the forward vector. And I think that there might be something weird about social impact finance baked into that, in the forward advance. Not that I feel good about cybernetics and the UN SDGs or any of that, but values being baked into your agent profile is part of it, in terms of what options are available to you, like what values you espouse. And it's interesting because when I was first doing the research on the Foundation for Integrated Education, there's this guy, Robert Hartman, and he was German, and one parent was Jewish and one was Catholic. And I think he went to a Catholic school where he wore a hair shirt and was very disciplined in his religious practice. And then he escaped Nazi Germany, and he worked for Walt Disney Company in Sweden and Mexico, which archetypes, right? And then later he became a professor at Ohio State. And then at the end of his career ended up at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, which is kind of Oak Ridge National Labs, in something called value-based axiometry. And so it was, and he's said to be the father of the 401k. And so if you imagine like these big investment funds, right, like the Vanguards and the State Streets and so on, they're managing the waveforms. And that's what I felt like. Why does Vanguard have several buildings, the Leander building, the Theseus building, the Neptune building? Like, why are they having mythological names on their buildings in this office park? It's strange. But I think that they may be steering the topology somehow. okay, so the tokens are the signals across space-time, holding new patterns and like steering a ship. Like how do we, and that's the thing about the Navy too, is that they're very good at distributed cognition. And they talk about, like, there's a guy, I can't remember who he was, but he studied distributed cognition on giant Navy ships where no one person could control like what's at the front and what's at the back and what's in the engine room. And like, it's a way everybody is sensing around the perimeters, and then they have to coordinate together to make this like giant thing, like get in the berth, or whatever. And so yeah, I think there's all of this that connects to flying and flocking. So I'm just going to close out because I know this seems really rambly. And, and again, thank you to the person who left this comment, because I'm not trying to like diss you. I'm just trying to say, it's not that I've intellectually checked out. It's just that I'm looking in places that no one else is looking. And I'm not even necessarily saying it's all actionable, but it's stuff that appeals to me, that's on my journey, that feels really connected to like energetic resonance and land and oscillators and quartz and economics and the heart field, that overlaps with the Vesta House people being here and their connection to Kevin Kelly and complexity and Neal Stephenson, that I find it really fun. And so like I have a handful of people who also find it fun, but it doesn't mean that you're going to find it fun. And it doesn't mean that the thing that I find is fun is going to save the world. It might just save me. So anyway, okay. So now I'm going to read about Maeve in Fall Dodge and Hell. And remember, see, the crow is really important. And again, the coding and the numbers, like I really feel like we're resonant energy patterns. And that's what I said in the read aloud the last time with Athena. And in this book, it's interesting because this one is did I say 2019? I think it's 2019. One of the setups in the beginning is that these hackers stage a really complex scenario where they fake that Moab, Utah was destroyed by a nuclear weapon. And they create such chaos on the internet that it essentially breaks the internet, and it sets the stage for like a trustworthy internet, which would be the blockchain agentic AI. And again, Neal Stephenson is always like really on the low key about, oh, I don't know much about blockchain, or I don't know much about this, but he's kind of, an extension of Kevin Kelly and the Stuart Brand and the Long Now Foundation. So I'm pretty sure that he does know about a lot of these things. So that's the setup. And in this character, Maeve, she's Australian and she's a double amputee. And she is a river rafting guide in Moab. And somehow the head of this terrain, not the head, but like a high level executive in this terrain company, who also is a live action role play character with Roman legionnaires, he gets called in from his like bivouac with his LARPy element. And he gets told to like try to get to Moab to neutralize the situation, or like position the company in a situation that's not going to be all messed up. And it turns out this game is actually infrastructure for economic flow state, right? And so he arrives, and his contact is Maeve, who is this double amputee river rafting guide in Moab. And so they end up getting together, and then it turns out in getting together, then she becomes targeted by crazy people, and so they have to like destroy her identity on the internet and essentially like take the internet down and rebuild it like with tokens. And so Maeve is a character in that way, but what she brings to the narrative, besides just holding space for that to happen, is that as a double amputee who's using prosthetics, she is talking about like how you exist as a physical body and what extends you, whether it's mechanical legs or clothing. And she had done a clothing line because her sister had died of skin cancer. So she has these different kind of special clothes, and that it's your interface with the world is like these snap-on things that you put on, like makeup is an interface, and clothing is an interface, and legs are an interface. And so that our bodies are much more flexible in how they present themselves and how they engage with the environment than most people are trained at thinking about. So then she and Corvallis, who ends up being the crow guy and the fairy woman, they get married. And so she has access to, she ends up just being a stay-at-home mom and has, a lot of financial security. And in the backdrop to this book is that the head of the company unexpectedly dies after an outpatient procedure, and he signed back in the 90s some agreement with the equivalent of the extropians to have his mind uploaded. And it's a use case for this other guy who's like the villain, who is dying of an illness, and he wants to get his mind uploaded, but Dodge is the first one to go. And that in this emergent consciousness, it's how it all, like how this data self-assembles in this autopoietic way into a universe called Bitworld. And so I read it once, and I got a fair bit out of it, but I hadn't really leaned into the active inference free energy principle. And then with that lens, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is exactly what is happening. And although Stephenson calls it like his version of Paradise Lost, a lot of it is about how consciousness emerges and becomes more sophisticated and then individualizes, and then other people start uploading into the system. And it's interesting when I talk about like Pan and the fairies and how they present and the archetypes, that in one of the phases, like the new spirits show up and they need a model of what to look like. And so the missionaries have like left the main town to have these towns on the outskirts, and they have these really cobbled together like statues that are badly done with like, they're not really quite symmetrical, and they're like, they've got chisel marks and they're a little weird. And then the spirits fashion themselves like that because that's the model. And then the other people who look more like normal people, they're like, oh, you're so broken. The people who look as we would call normal, they're like, because you should look like this strange asymmetry, chisel marked, pock marked thing. And they're like, whoa, no, I'm pretty sure that's not it. And they're like, no, you're the broken one. No, you're the broken one. And it's all just, what is the normalized template? So anyway, so there's this game, more and more people are uploaded. There's an interface that for people to watch what's going on in the game that is consciousness for like dead people to have their minds uploaded. And it's studied academically, and there are these conferences. And so this is and then essentially the bit world is mining energy from the real world to run itself. And so it's strange. And then eventually in the real world, people start not fully living in the real world because something might happen to them and they might have an accident and they can't have their mind uploaded, and then they can't live forever. So they just retreat into like telepresence work, and they don't ever leave their house because they might trip and fall and, not have someone save them in time to have their brain uploaded. So they stop living in the real world, but they're mostly living in the game world. It's kind of an interesting thing. So anyway, and in that, the villain, quote unquote, he's mad at Dodge because Dodge is building this bit world with scraps from his childhood in Iowa, and Elle thinks that he should have been able to do something better, and there should be more opportunities to work in different parts of morphospace, and he has a point. So anyway, so this is at one of the conferences, and this is about Maeve, and again, Maeve is the double amputee, and she's talking about what it will be like when she gets uploaded into Bitworld, since she doesn't have legs. Now, I want to point out that early on, when I was researching XAPI technology, which is our Tin Can API, which is what sort of links all of these different data points into a digital learning locker for ed tech, and they had SCORM, Shareable Content Object Reference Module, which was for laptops, but it didn't work for VR glasses and phones and iPads. And so that's what XAPI was for. And this is all military technology through advanced distributed learning, which was set up by Bill Clinton. So again, we're back to Arkansas, right? And, and I keep thinking, like when I talk about Findhorn, that I believe that the equivalent of Findhorn in Arkansas was supposed to be Meadow Creek, which was a pilot meta-industrial village set up by William Irwin Thompson, who had connections to Findhorn and Lawrence Rockefeller. So people are like, Arkansas? What? I'm like, no, there's a lot going on in Arkansas. And, Alice Walton is here. She's one of the richest women in the world, and she's working with Deepak Chopra and people on rewilding the mind. And we're really in a very important place. Like, we're a backwater for a reason, I think. So Clinton had signed that executive order to set up advanced distributed learning that later developed XAPI. And it was all through military simulation gaming technology. And there was a slide deck from JCA Solutions, which was a defense contractor in Orlando, that in addition to having like models of kids in VR glasses modeling how they would work in an Amazon warehouse factory, There was another image of a person hanging from like a pyramid shape, like a wire pyramid frame with VR glasses, like flying. And so this would have been at least 2017, 2018. It was at the early part of my research. And so that XAPI would get those data points. And so when I'm talking about flying, right, and the birds, I think this is really a thing. And again, the military is figuring it out already. So here is the conversation about Maeve, who doesn't have legs, and what will happen to her in Bitworld when she gets uploaded. And Enoch is Enoch Root, who is an immortal figure in the Cryptonomicon, Baroque cycle, now Reamde Fall narrative. Okay, thus the problematic Mag 0-2 processes. When Enoch, as the eminence grisé of people whose job it was to think about this stuff, proposed that everyone should just give up on any hope of trying to fit those weird old souls into a systematic picture, most of them were hugely relieved and excited by the prospect of buckling down to work on a project that actually might have some hope of success, or at least discernible progress, namely trying to make sense of the vastly more numerous, recently uploaded souls and their relationship to quote-unquote life and death, or as Enoch had dubbed it, death after death. Those more recently booted up souls had enough in common with one another that one could at least begin to think about them systematically. They all consumed about the same amount of resources. Their virtual bodies all had roughly the same shape and size, and they all affected one another and the inanimate things around them through the same kinds of interactions. That's like cellular automata. Which were, when you came down to it, close copies, reproductions, performances of the bodies people had in meat space and the way those bodies related to one another and to the world. And you couldn't have that without mortality, or at least morbidity. So amortality, both as a philosophical abstraction and a feature pitched by service providers to their customers, was that your soul would always be rebooted if something went badly wrong. And it wouldn't be a totally fresh start. It wasn't as if the new memories accumulated during the afterlife that had just ended were erased. Efforts would be made to preserve some continuous thread of identity, connecting the new life just being rebooted back to the one that had been cut short by the falling tree or whatever. And I think that's the directed acyclic graph. Besides amortality, other big topics addressed by the sages of Sluza included morphoteleology and phased embodiment. Morpho meant form, and teleology meant something that was preordained, determined in advance, frequently used as a scare word by people who believe things ought to develop on their own without constraints. In this case, the notion was that the industry had actually taken a wrong turn when it had started to heed the advice of neurologists and gone to full body scanning. Because, of course, if you scan nerves all the way down to the toes and simulated interactions of gut bacteria with the cells of the intestinal lining, why, the resultant processes in Bitworld wouldn't feel complete until they had created digital toes and digital stomachs and everything in between. Digital life had the potential to be so much more than biolife, and yet the morphoteleologists were going about it in a basically flawed way that ensured that the souls of Bitworld would remain trapped in a tiny, crowded, and not very interesting corner of the space of all possibilities. And this is what I'm talking about with the Levin's work. They could no longer become gods or angels. Phased embodiment was a proposed solution to both A, morphoteleology, and B, the reality that sustainable infrastructure couldn't be built on Earth fast enough to immediately give every single dead person a full humanoid body and a nice plot of land in Bitworld. Simulating the clear stream running past your homestake, babbling merrily over rocks, not to mention the smoke coming out of your chimney, was expensive. It was doable at Mag 7, but couldn't be ramped up fast enough to keep pace with the death rate. Dead people could still be scanned, and the scans could, of course, be archived and maybe even booted up as new processes, but giving them fancy places to live with high-quality grade qualia was not physically possible and might not be for a few decades, which, as the computing centers bogged down under all that load, could correspond to centuries in Bitworld. Or they could have just booted everything up at full resolution on the equipment they had. This would work on an engineering level, but the time-slip ratio would slow to a crawl. Years might pass in meat space while the babbling brook and swirling chimney smoke calculations were performed to simulate just a few seconds of elapsed time in Bitworld. which would make no difference at all to a soul in Bitworld, since their consciousness would be slowed down as well. And so they would experience the qualia of the brook, smoke, etc., in precisely the same way as if everything had been running 1,000 times faster. But for spectators watching Bitworld from Meat Space using ever fancier versions of the landform visualization utility, it would be boring and frustrating, like trying to watch a movie over a slow connection that stopped every few seconds to buffer more data. This would create what amounted to a PR and marketing problem since, in marketing speak, spectation was the main driver of customer acquisition. And that was how Sluza took in money, which was how it paid for more, faster equipment. According to people on L's side of the pond, phased embodiment was the answer. Souls could be booted up immediately in a far more resource-efficient form that was similar in many ways to the WAD. The original WAD, developing on its own, had been very expensive with a lot of wasted cycles. But L's engineers had figured out a way to make similar systems that were far more efficient. For example, they could communicate directly instead of simulating the biological processes of speech and hearing. So the WAD is like a hive mind. Having a simplified form and communicating through data packets might not have been how most customers envisioned themselves spending all of eternity, but it was better than being dead, and it would give them some time to exist in a kind of fluid, embryonic, less than fully embodied limbo for a while, during which they could perhaps explore creative alternatives to the one-size-fits-all humanoid plan that the morphoteleological elites were foisting on them. The human fetus floating in amniotic fluid wasn't yet a fully realized human, but it wasn't a bad experience. And so again, I think that links to like the idea of a hive mind or an ant computer that is working outside of embodied human constraints. For better or worse, it's hard to judge. I'm not judging. I'm just saying they're building structures of group mind at lower energy levels that are engaging in non-traditional communication forms like telepathy and other embodied experiences. And so I think L, who's the character that's pitching this, he's doing it from an economic standpoint, but he's also doing it because he's interested in like how might they navigate other parts of that morphospace and what are other capacities that would be unlocked, not unlike Michael Levin's anthrobots, right? The trachea cells that are moved around and turned into like living robot things with little squiggle tails. That. So it's in the book in 2019. Keen was the interest of Maeve, so Maeve is the double amputee, in morphoteleology and the related topics of idiomorphs, souls mostly from the Mag 0 to 2 era that had non-humanoid forms. And that kind of goes back to the Findhorn and Crombie and the elementals. It took Corvallis, and Corvallis is her husband, some time to understand just how Keen, and by that time their relationship was pretty much doomed, at least if you defined relationship as anything even remotely like a traditional marriage. She'd always been cagey. The one time in her young life she'd really bared her passion to the world's scrutiny had been the founding of Aesthetics, which is Sthetix, Aesthetics, which hadn't gone well and had driven her into a reclusive life in the canyon lands around Moab, and that was the clothing company. After meeting Corvallis, she had spent several years as an internet hate speech lightning rod, which had been fascinating in a way, but it was essentially a passive role. A work of performance art, the point of which was to obliterate her real identity and bury it in a million miles deep under fake news. Any thinking person who paid attention to that spectacle would end up asking, but who is this person really? And to the extent that the project had succeeded, it had only made her real identity that much more enigmatic. Under that cover, she had, with Corvallis, raised 3 children in a weirdly normal urban soccer mom style. They had never made a decision that he'd work full-time and she wouldn't. It had just developed along those lines. Under a pseudonym, she had maintained for 3 years a blog called, quote, Luxury Crossover SUV as Prosthesis, in which she reimagined the elite mom lifestyle as a centaur-like existence in which one's body, and hence identity, effectively merged with the vehicle in which one spent several hours a day, stuck in traffic between various child-related errands, or spiraling up and down immense multi-level parking structures while absorbed in podcasts or engaged in Bluetooth-mediated telepathy with other such persons. And I think that's a really interesting image, right? The centaur, the car is, and you know, and it's man and machine, like the merging. And that's, again, where I'm talking about like aviation, especially like high level aviation where the body is merged with the machine and you're working as one. Okay. She had pursued a thread originating in Greek mythology, according to which centaurs were in some cases benevolent nurturers linked to the healing arts. The blog was witty, but a little too unsparing and scary smart to attract a wide audience. She had maybe 10,000 followers at peak, but they had a tendency to age out as their kids got into their teens. And anyway, the era of the awesomely huge, gleaming luxury crossover SUV was coming to an end. Like Tolkien's elves fading away and going into the West, they were dissolving into the used market as many families were downsizing their fleets in favor of ride-sharing services, and then fully autonomous vehicles that were owned by no one and everyone. So by the time Maeve's and Corvallis's kids were in the 9 to 12 range, she had stopped writing the blog and intellectually/artistically gone dark for a decade. And then suddenly the kids were out of the house, and Maeve, like a butterfly unfolding itself from a chrysalis, had begun to unfurl some of what she had quietly been making of herself in that darkness. And much of that was hard to make out even for Corvallis. It had got its start in her identity as an amputee and user of artificial legs, but it would have been reductive and patronizing to say that was all there was to it. The amputee thing was only a thin crevice into which she had, decades ago, inserted the tip of an intellectual pry bar. She'd been worrying away at it ever since, listening to podcasts, downloading dissertations, going to the occasional academic conference, and at Act Anns, always in the back of the room paying attention and filling notebooks with tiny, neat writing. But she hadn't really got purchased. She hadn't found the leverage she needed to work that pry bar and break the thing wide open until the people at Act Anns had begun talking about morphoteleology, about the whole body scanning all the way down to the toes, whereupon she had taken to waving her legs in the air and asking, "What about those of us who don't have toes?" Much later, when she was not around anymore, C+ would go back and watch the video of Maeve in those days making trouble during Q&A time at the Act Ann sessions. "I get what you're on about," she insists to an eminent but somewhat dense neurologist at Act Anns 4. "But if your thinking becomes normative and the system expects it, does that mean I won't have legs in Bitworld? Because when you scan my corpse, my toes are going to come up missing, aren't they? My avatar will be lacking those, I take it? Once an amputee, always an amputee?" "Understood," said the neurologist, "but the nerves that used to lead down to your toes are still there. They are truncated at the knee, yes, but above, where they connect to the parts of your brain involved in motor function and so on, the connections are still there, somewhat atrophied, perhaps." "Atrophy is not a word I love," Maeve cuts him off. "Look, our brains adapt. Mine had adapted to not having lower legs, and when I was a child, I had phantom pain, and now I don't. Call it atrophy if you want. To me, it's plasticity, adaptation, growth, eutropy." "Call it what you like," said the neurologist. "That adaptation will, of course, be reflected in the scan of your brain, and as such, it will be correctly simulated when a process based on that scan is booted up. Beyond that, to be honest, we don't know much, because we still don't know why souls in Bitworld adopt the forms that they do. And so I simply cannot tell you what shape your simulated body will take. I would hope that it would develop a normal set of lower legs and learn to use them." At this point, Corvallis looks away, almost wincing, because he knows that the neurologist has stepped in it big time. But instead of burning him to the ground, Maeve visibly checks herself and decides to educate him. Or maybe that's the wrong way to think of it. It's more that she's thinking out loud, articulating for the first time a set of ideas that have been incubating at least since her first failed startup. "I would hope not," she says, and then perhaps realizing she's in danger of being written off as a mouthy firebrand, she changes tack a little. "Or rather, I would hope for more than you seem comfortable with, and that's what I want to push on. Your comfort level. Why is it where it is? How the boundaries could be messed with. Dodge has wings." "What?" He's caught off balance, not following the shifts. "Dodge has wings," she repeats. "We don't know when he acquired them because he already had them when the LUV was first brought online. He and the other Mag 0 to 2 processes have weird, idiomorphic bodies. Some don't have bodies at all. They were all booted up from scans that we now consider to be lower resolution, head-only scans. They were all effectively decapitated, weren't they? Now that's what I call an amputee. So they had to regrow bodies. They made them up as they went along. The new processes, on the other hand, are based on better scans all the way down to the stumps. And at the same time, we see much less freedom, much less creativity, if you will, in body shape among the MAG 3 to 4 processes. How can we regain that freedom? Freedom to have a non-humanoid body? Yes, I want wings. The neurologist glances nervously off camera. Years later, watching the video, Corvallis knows exactly who he's looking at. A couple of elves people standing there silently observing this conversation. This makes him nervous because everyone knows by this point that El has been creating winged souls, angels, in Bitworld. It's one of those things that's widely known among the kinds of people who go to act ands, but most of those people prefer to whisper about it in bars. Only Maeve is able to be so indiscreet. Again, we can't say for certain, and I agree that we see correlation between higher fidelity scans and more conventional humanoid morphology. Does that mean we should deliberately downgrade scan quality? I would be extremely hesitant to take any customer's remains and scan them at anything less than the best quality we can possibly achieve. And once you have that data, you have to put all the data at the disposal of the process. You can't withhold information just based on a vague supposition that doing so would give that process the freedom to sprout wings. Forget sprouting. What if the wings are already there? Maeve asks. I don't understand what you mean by that. Neurologically, what if the brain is already hooked up in such a way that it knows it has wings? Go on, because to be frank, this conversation is fun and interesting, but I have no idea where you're going. My brain started out like yours. It thought it had toes. And then my legs were removed. And at first I had phantom pain, but then my brain decided it didn't have toes. And if I die tomorrow and get scanned and booted up, that's still what my simulated brain is going to be expecting. I'm with you so far. So what if my brain does expect wings? The neurologist can do nothing but smile and turn his hands palm up, which is how the conversation ends. But it was after that that Maeve began to train her brain to expect wings. Having a lot of free time and a lot of money made this easier. Virtual reality systems had become awfully convincing by that point. She hired a team of programmers as well as an aerodynamicist who specialized in the flight of birds, and they rigged up a system in circus school down by Boeing Field where Maeve could be suspended in a harness from a web of cables that were reeled in or paid out so as to move her through three-dimensional space. A VR rig covered her eyes and fed her matching imagery, most importantly moving images of imaginary wings, which she could see if she turned her head to one side or the other. Embedded in the same rig were sensors, reading faint signals from her brain. Years earlier, such systems had advanced to the point where quadriplegics could use them to control wheelchairs or robotic limbs just by thinking. Sorry about that. And Maeve had, of course, read all the papers that had been written about the changes that took place in the patient's brains as they got better and better at using those systems. There were drugs you could take and procedures you could undergo to enhance neuroplasticity. She tried them all, with effects on her personality and on their marriage that were, to put it gently, a personal growth opportunity for Corvallis. And when he complained that she was becoming a different person, she reminded him none too gently that that was the entire point of what she was doing. More in that vein started to spill out afterwards. He got an earful about their first meeting in Moab, the first time they'd had sex, her long unspoken suspicion that there had been something a little odd about that encounter. Did C+ have a thing for amputees? He could say in perfect honesty he did not. But a helpless woman who needed saving? Maybe. So he backed away and stopped sharing his opinions and his concerns about what she was doing. It was fascinating. Far outside the bounds of legit peer-reviewed research, more of a performance art project. But there were noble precedents for art leading the way, and science following in its wake. And under the cover of art, she was able to take it to a place where scientists were at least willing to attend demonstrations at ACTANs and watch Maeve fly through a simulated environment, and to look at the data visualizations where she and her staff showed data about what was going on in her brain. And from the very beginning, Elle's people paid very close attention indeed, and more than once when Maeve began a new branch of her investigation, she found evidence that researchers based in Zelkirk-Alberg had got there first. Which was hardly surprising. In life, Elmo Shepherd had been no fan of morphoteleology, and in death, he was surrounded by a host of angels. It's pretty deep, right? So if you needed to be able to train a body to go into something outside of 3D space-time, you need new kind of simulations to do it. And you need to be able to hook the psyche up to the body. And that's what she was doing. And later in the book, her husband, when he comes to the end of his real lifetime, he reuses the equipment to train to be a crow. And that's the crow in the front of the book. And flying through the data visualizations, that links to, Sean had found this something called the allosphere, ALOSPHERE, in Santa Barbara. Again, Santa Barbara, so many things. Theoretical physics. And in this allosphere, it's like a multi-dimensional immersive space where it can represent data visually in unusual configurations, and that you can manipulate data in ways that are like a composer or an artist, a visual artist. You can work with data in intuitive ways that are outside of writing all these languages. And so all of these indicators just make me feel like this is what's happening, is that we're moving into an era in which we're going to be interfacing with information fields that are originating, that exist outside of our slice that we see on a daily basis. Probably there are people that know that. Like, I think you can't, like, if you want to imagine that those are the bad guys or a cabal or the occult or the hidden or all of this stuff, like, I just don't know how useful it is, because if some of these folks came in and said, hey, I think the world actually works like a projective geometry hologram, where there's this imaginal world, and through our heart resonance and our energy fields, like, we're individually and collectively like surfing reality and creating the narrative arcs that we see, they would just be called crazy, right? I mean, it would be hard to, if you said it publicly, because the scaffolding to get people there would take so long. And, I say this as someone who, starting in 2013, right, I started researching the school stuff. And so it's been 12 years. And there's stuff that at the beginning of the journey, if you had told me that these would be ideas that I would be entertaining, I would never have believed you. So, and I'm pretty motivated. Like, I mean, I really dedicate, it was my at least part-time, and if not now full-time job, to do that work. How are you supposed to cut through the other narratives that are competing with this to try to, and it's such a polarized environment to even tell people. So I just don't find it useful to be like, oh, there are these bad guys who are keeping the secret operations of the world under wraps. Like, I don't know that, I mean, you could pick that story for sure, but I don't think that's the only story. I mean, I live a quarter mile off of Albert Pike Road. Yeah, Albert Pike he was from Massachusetts, but he spent most of his life in Little Rock, Arkansas. He was a lawyer to the tribes here in the Washitas and in Oklahoma. What did he learn from them, right? At the end of his life, he wrote a 600-page book on the Rig Veda and Aryan gods. Yeah, he wrote the book on Freemasonry, and you can imagine what you want to imagine about what Freemasonry is, but there's this other stuff, like, did he understand how the world works? And he was a lawyer, so again, it's logic, it's structure. So what does it mean, right? That I'm off of like Hobson's Choice and Mission Street and Albert Pike, that do I not have a choice beyond taking this mission and trying to figure out what Albert Pike was really about? Because I want to know, not to control the world. I'm just curious, like, what is it? Like, it just is this amazing puzzle. And I mean, Edward Franklin, one of his Langland lectures, he talks about like trying to put together pieces of the puzzle without the box, right? And that we work together and we're all building like little units. Like, I'm working on the lake and you're working on the barn and you're working on the sky or the tree. And we're all building these pieces, but like eventually we're going to have enough to start to put it all together. And I mean, that's what I'd like to spend my time working on, not to be afraid and finding the bad guy. That's just, it's less interesting to me now because I don't know. And within this idea of accessing information fields, to me, this feels like the Akashic Records. And I'll just close by saying a lot of that was promoted by Ervin Laszlo. And again, I had a lot of really strong feelings about Ervin Laszlo early on because his work with like research into Giordano Bruno and his son, Alexander Laszlo was part of Global Education Futures Forum with Pavel Luksha, the transhumanist. And again, you see these words and they're highly triggering. And I'm not saying I'm not triggered by them anymore, but like I'm able to situate it better because I know more and I'm less afraid because I feel like I have more agency in how I hold the story. And so Ervin Laszlo was really interested in this idea of the Akashic Records. He had developed, he created the Club of Budapest, and he had a group working with him on, it was like general evolutionary systems, something like that. It was definitely like systems evolution. And part of that group included Rianne Einsler and her husband, David Loy, who was, I think, in the Navy, but also a social scientist. And the two of them were close with Ralph Abrams, who was the mathematician at UC Santa Cruz that was working on the Chaos Gaia Eros book. And Rianne Einsler, she wrote this book, The Chalice and the Blade, which is about sort of archetypal energies of masculine and feminine. And she was the keynote speaker at Galia Benartzi's Bretton Woods 75 conference, right? And Charles Eisenstein was there, and Michaela Ullior was there, and John Rogers was there. Like all these key people were there, including with central bankers and the Bitcoin people. And they're talking about evolution because I think the pattern holding is probably going to be some stable coin, like a Bitcoin with a community currency for a backup signal. And one of the investors here in Vesta House like worked on coordinating that gathering. So what is this evolution? And things change. Things are always changing. So could it change in a good way? And getting into the Akashic Records and into these information fields and flying, whether you're flying as a crow or a fairy or a fighter jet, like you're in there and you're targetedly getting information out that's going to guide how this reality happens. And I don't even say, I will say I misspoke there, this reality. I don't think there's one reality. I think somewhere in here it was talking about like truth or standing up. I don't know. There was something about the truth or reality. And I'm like, I just don't think there's one. I think there's infinite stories that we're in. So we're probably going to be in Hollands. We're in resonating communities that are sharing stories. We're going through our stories and all the stories happen. So I don't feel any compulsion to bump people off the story that they're in or defend my story against their story. We can just be like, oh, that's your story. That's interesting. And sometimes you might find that there's overlap between the stories and it's something you hadn't thought about. And that's pretty cool. But I don't think we have to fight about it. And I think like on my diamond, non-human companion animal clip that I put up, like somebody jumped on there and they were like, the Bible says and Jesus says and whatever. And I'm like, that's fine. If that's how you feel about it, that's okay. Like, I'm not going to be here to tell you not to feel that way about it. That's how you're feeling. And yeah, and it's all like, you do you and I do me, and meet you on this other side. And we integrate all the things. So anyway, and I forgot to say, so this is the last thing. So getting into the Akashic, flying, projective geometry. The other thing about Olive Witcher, who was part of the projective sacred geometry stuff with, part of it had to do with infinity points, interior and exterior infinity points, and the sun, and counter space. And I need to learn more about all of those things. But the infinity points and having two infinity points like inner and outer and talking about one being the sun, is that Helios is the god of the central sun. And according to like the mythology, Vesta is his consort. And so you have these two infinity points of the sun and the hearth, the outer and the inner. And yeah, so we have Vesta House here, right? And so that's interesting to me. And the other thing about Olive Witcher, and again, this is going to push buttons for people because they're like, I know what that is. And I'm not saying good, bad. I'm just hold the curious observer pose, is that Olive Witcher was teaching courses in projective geometry with the anthroposophist in the UK. And one of her students, and this was, I think, like in the 40s around World War II, was a woman named Frida Harris. And she was a baroness or something like that. She was, up there, and she was an artist. And she was working with Aleister Crowley to do the Thoth tarot deck. And then evidently that particular deck, so he just wanted to kind of get it done, but she's like, no, it has to be done properly. And so it was a much longer process, like 4 years of her doing the paintings and working on really condensing all of the knowledge that he had into the images. But the images really were based structurally, the composition, on projective geometry. And I don't know that much about the tarot and the decks, but that, like, when you do card layouts, there's something about like the geometric angles that they interpenetrate one another, like with these energy fields, which is pretty interesting. And then the family that acquired the original paintings is the Warburg family, which is the banking family. And Abby Warburg, ABY, I don't know if you say Abby Warburg, he was an art historian, but from the Warburg banking family. So last year they had an exhibit on tarot decks and the Warburgs, and that those deck was featured there. So that's pretty interesting. And then when I wrote one of my blog posts about Namshubs, part of it involved a discussion of blockchain government. And one of the early promoters of blockchain government, I think she described it as a vending machine government, was Bettina Warburg, with same Warburg family. So in the because in this live action role play, in the McDowell live action role play, everything goes back to Neal Stephenson. I know these are all backwards, but Neal Stephenson, this is, I think, a 2017 book, and look how thick these are. Like, I mean, he must be channeling these books or something like that. This is called The Rise and Fall of DODO, and it's like the diachronic. It's about timeline jumping and the end of magic with photography, and then that it's set in the present day. And it's the U.S. intelligence community working on Sumerian ciphers to figure out how to reinstate magic in a tiny telephone box that's like Schrodinger's cat box, with the one surviving Hungarian witch. And of course, it's always hungry. And doing timeline management. And in the book, there's a particular character and his family, he's from the Fugger family, Fugger, which there is actually a Fugger family. And like the first planned social community in Germany was called the Fuggerei. And it was backed by this family. But so that family is actually real. But in the book, he's talking about managing art and managing money and managing timelines. And I have a clip in one of my slide deck on my channel that's pulling from that audiobook about the Fuggers talking about managing art and timelines and economics. And so there is something really important about markets in all of this. And, when I was doing my first ed tech work, it was all going back to the hedge funds. And again, like I said, impact investing is very much linked to the insurance companies, and not just the insurance companies, like the parametric insurance companies. It's betting upon betting upon betting. And then there's the legal betting, which is insurance and hedge funds. And then there's the illegal betting for so long, which Hot Springs was deeply involved with. So to me, I've got a lot of things on this pinboard, but just think about Maeve and her imagining that her wings are already there and playing with the idea of both the wonders of being embodied and the limitations of being embodied and what the other options in morphospace might be and how much of us are material and how much of us are energy vibrations and how much of us are patterns and how might we interpenetrate energy fields with intention or with care, and how does that all happen? Because I think if we can't imagine it, like if we can't pull it in from the mundus imaginalis, it's not going to come. There has to be someone here that does it, like the future of computing. Oh, and this is the last thing. I always say it's the last thing, but this is really the last thing. So my friend Laura, she's always on point about sending me really interesting links because I'm sort of checked out of a lot of stuff. But she sent me this morning that Neal Stephenson of Lamina One, in November, I think, a few months ago, he launched. So Lamina One is a blockchain platform with art, and it's with Peter Vicens, I think, who was a founder of the Bitcoin Foundation, and this is called Artifact, and it's a game, and it's on blockchain. And it's sort of a post-AI apocalypse game, like a teaming game that there's artifacts and then there's jobs and then there's payment systems. And one of the job posting boards, it says like, we want to optimize your biology. And so this, again, just gets back to the Claude Shannon, that the people are the computers, right? The Human Energy Project, the Noosphere Project, the people are the computers. And I think it has to do with quantum biology and quantum psychiatry and microtubules and resonance and flying through this mathematical space, instead of just a small select group of oracles that somehow like it's going to be oracular at a massive scale. And I'm not endorsing, I'm just saying if we can't even conceptualize that might be the game board, we're still spinning around with like there's imaginary enemies that are targeting you with imagining energy fields, and you don't know what you're doing, and you're probably in information warfare and all this stuff. Like you're in that attractor basin. And that attractor basin, like maybe you really like it there. I didn't like it there, so I bumped out. And I'm not judging people who like it there, but there's way many other basins to be in. And I want to surf like around the edges, and as opposed to getting dishing down in the bottom. Like I'd rather stay, like I think the curious observer part of the toolkit and the infinite game part of the toolkit is that like you can get a higher view, like you can be the crow, like flying over the terrain and seeing the distance. And that's, in Fall at the end when Corvallis turns into a crow, he on the quest, he's the one who has the foresight, like who has the distance to navigate this chaotic terrain. And so but it takes everything. So I'm not like, I might be the archetype that I want to be the forager and I want to be the crow flying over the things. And there may be people who just really want to ground in a particular story. And so that's fair. That's fair. It's just how I see it. So anyway, thanks for listening, everybody. All right, bye.